The law also enables officials to investigate suspicious marriages and to null fraudulent marriages. That is, marriages contracted not out of love, but for reasons of immigration, i.e. mariage blanc, which are explicit green card marriages, or mariage gris, which are extra fraudulent marriages in which one spouse is duped by the other. And it's always generally configured as a young Arab or African man duping an older white French woman, right, into marrying him. A similar 2003 immigration law intended to combat marital fraud allows officials to interview prospective marriage partners separately if they become suspicious about the true intentions of one or both of the partners. Historian Judith Sirkis has rightly noted that these laws aimed at regulating immigrant marriages are acts of national sovereignty, a sovereignty that is exercised by policing women's, and especially Muslim women's, sexual freedom in the name of protecting it. The regulation of migrant marriages and the state's attendant scrutiny of migrant intimacies parallel other measures deployed against immigrant and immigrant origin women to guarantee the republic's sex norms. In March 2003, for example, a new law on internal security criminalized passive soliciting for sex, whereby the police have the power to determine what constitutes soliciting. Any woman whose dress or attitude gives the impression that she's soliciting money for sex now faces a fine and up to 2 months in prison. The law also mandates that a non-national arrested for passive soliciting can have her residence permit revoked, a clear indication of this new law's location in a larger project of immigration control. These exercises in national state sovereignty, whose goal is to normalize migrant sex and make it Republican and secular, depends on penetrating into and surveilling the ostensibly private domain of the bedroom and individual desire. Both the marriage laws I just discussed and the 2003 law on passive soliciting call for public officials to determine the unstated intentions of the subjects under their watch. Civil officials must determine whether the couple before them genuinely loves one another, the normative basis for companionate marriage, or whether their marriage is a fraud, i.e. not really about love, asking probing questions that reveal the nature of whatever intimacy exists between partners. So what is your partner's favorite sexual position is therefore a common question. Similarly, police must determine whether a woman on the street intends to solicit sex, reading her behavior and dress as external signs of an interior intention. In both these instances, public officials must render external and public that which is ostensibly internal and private, and do so in the name of upholding a normative sexuality undergirded by a strong distinction between private and public, internal and external, intimate and political. Put another way, the reformation of immigrant subject sexual behavior so as to reproduce the particular arrangement of public-private on which secular Republican sexuality depends requires the constant trespass of that boundary. Significantly, a number of self-declared Muslim women, or musulman laïques, have become key players in the state's project to reform immigrant sexuality, most notably Fadila Amaha and Lubna Melian, the co-founders of Ni Putes Ni Soumis, or Neither Whores Nor Doormats, a group protesting the denigration of immigrant origin women in the banlieue or outer city suburbs. Much of the success of Ni Putes Ni Soumis can be attributed to the way in which its leaders offer themselves and are eagerly read as liberated, integrated counterparts to the paradigmatic menace of the veiled woman, or the musulman voilée. In this narrative, liberation and integration hinge on these secular Muslim women's active embrace of secular Republican heterosexual norms. In her autobiography, for example, Amaha identifies wearing makeup and certain forms of dress, to quote her, short skirts, tight-fitting jeans, low-cut blouses, and short t-shirts as necessary to showing off our femininity against the backdrop of repressive Muslim patriarchy. Similarly, Melian once remarked, and I quote Melian, "It's better to wear a mini skirt and take up one's femininity than to hide it behind a veil in order to avoid the gaze of others," unquote. Melian and Amaha thus identify certain sartorial practices as essential to femininity and consequently define femininity as sexual availability to the male gaze. They also posit wearing makeup and revealing clothes as acts of sexual liberation and sexual equality. Within this rhetoric of sexual availability as sexual normality, Veiling comes to be seen not just as anti-secular, but as sexually abnormal and fundamentally sexually oppressive. Melian's and Amaha's interventions highlight the way in which sex norms and secular norms have become coextensive in France. Now, if successful integration into the Republic entails the inhabitation of secular sexuality, it is perhaps unsurprising that the autobiography, the most intimate of nonfiction genres, has emerged as a popular source of information about Muslim French women's lives. The most powerful remains Samira Belil's Dans l'enfer des tourmentes, or in the hell of gang rapes, in which Belil narrates her journey from abuse at the hands of her father, to her trauma as the victim of multiple gang rapes and housing projects, to her descent into alcohol and drug addiction, to her ultimate recovery, which includes learning how to have normal sexual and romantic relationships. Though Belil clearly considered this a profoundly personal journey and wrote it as part of her therapy, her therapist encouraged her to publish it, and it was marketed by her publishers as a window into the general sexual savagery of the banlieue. According to the publisher, the text, and I quote, unveils the sexual violence that has been institutionalized and made ordinary in the banlieue, unquote. The metaphor of unveiling used by Belil's publisher is significant. For as much as Belil pulls back the veil on life in the banlieue, she does so by offering up her troubled, familial, sexual, and romantic life for public perusal. The structure of that double unveiling underscores the way in which the narrative of secular Republican integration, in which normalized sexuality signals successful integration, requires women like Belil, Amaha, and Melian to reveal publicly the most intimate details of their private lives in order to be recognized as integrated subjects. If normal sex is private sex, these secular Muslim women must nonetheless prove their normality precisely by bringing their sex lives into the public sphere for monetized consumption by a literary public. Now, if Belil and others, by unveiling their private sexual lives, have been at least partially accepted as integrated subjects, other Muslim French women, and especially veiled women, have not, though they are no less incited to speak about their sexual beliefs and practices. Consider a January 2004 episode of 100 Minutes to Understand, entitled God and the Republic. And Francis famously sort of talk shows that, about laïcité and Islam. Though most of the show concerned the then proposed law banning religious signs, it suddenly veered midpoint into a pre-recorded segment on virginity certificates. The segment began by observing that many immigrant Muslim families demand certificates of virginity from their potential daughters-in-law. It then featured a local association that organizes against virginity certificates and includes a number of veiled women. The reporter interviews one of these veiled women, who states that though it remains important not to have sex before marriage, no woman should have to show herself off like that. This is the woman speaking. No woman should have to show herself off like that. Now, while such an attitude seems perfectly logical within an ethic of bodily sovereignty, the reporter frames these veiled women's position against virginity certificates as a paradox, noting amusedly that, and I quote the reporter here, even though they are against the certificate, they are for chastity before marriage, unquote. The short segment ends tangentially with the reporter's statement that women of immigrant descent are twice as likely to suffer sexual aggression as French women. Now, when the show came back to its debate format, the moderator immediately turned to Saïda Kada, a veiled Muslim French activist and one of a dozen or so guests, and asked, "Is what we heard true?" "Of course it is," Kada replied, "but we're speaking about something, i.e. sexual aggression and virginity certificates, we're speaking about something for which Islam and the veil are not responsible." Kada then quickly asserted her own disapproval of virginity certificates. Now, this moment is remarkable in exemplifying a common double move. Not only do secular Republicans explicitly associate the headscarf with abnormal sexual practices and sexual violence, but they also then demand that veiled women account for that association. Kada is immediately put on the spot, called upon to prove her normality as well as her legitimacy as an interlocutor by condemning aberrant sexual practices. Because she wears a headscarf and is immediately sexually suspect, Kada is compelled to reveal herself as sexually normal by stating her sexual beliefs in public. But precisely because she already wears a headscarf, because she is religiously suspect, She can never, in fact, be sexually normal within the terms of French secularity. Her viewpoint remains a paradox at best, fundamentalist double talk at worst. These overlapping acts of incitement, surveillance, and castigation occur in less mediatized settings as well. Karima, a longtime interlocutor, described to me the kind of deontic and discursive compulsions she experiences in her day-to-day life as a result of putting on the headscarf almost a decade ago. When you're a veiled Muslim woman, Karima began, and I'm going to quote her now, when you're a veiled Muslim woman, people want to know you intimately. Because the veil remains so maligned in France, you do everything to be accepted, unquote. Though she now feels less dependent on the acceptance of others for her own self-worth, she related how, in the first years of wearing the headscarf, she was constantly smiling and engaging others in order to prove that she was sans complexe, without hang-ups. And I quote, "They take away your speak with space to say, look, I'm normal. When I first wore the headscarf, I needed to speak to prove that I was normal," unquote. Karima's urge to speak echoes that experienced by Horia Demiati when the lawyer Varro demanded why she wears a headscarf. On the one hand, Demiati realized that her inner spirituality was her own private affair. On the other, she felt compelled to answer the question to show that underneath her headscarf she was normal. Now, if Demiati is compelled to speak publicly about religion and to reveal the inner workings of her spiritual and ethical life, Karima has had to talk about religion and sex. She described working with another veiled friend at a small law office in Paris, and I quote her again, "Our boss Anne saw right away that we were veiled. And you know what? Right away the questions came. How do you live? What do you think of polygamy? Tell me about your sexuality, etc." Karima answered honestly that she was not against polygamy, explaining that she found the framework of polygamy less troubling than adultery. But she's aware that saying so has consequences. I mean, I risk looking like a fundamentalist, she told me. She also recognized the dynamic at work in these incitements to speak about sex. "You're being tested," she said. "You're often spoken to about homosexuality, you're spoken to with crude words about sex. You're being tested. You have to prove that you're normal," unquote. She described another moment with Anne, who once said nonchalantly to Karima, her employee, recall, not her friend. She says nonchalantly to Karima that she would like to take a lover. Anne then asked Karima what she thought. Laughing incredulously at the memory, Karima continued, "What does she want me to say? It's haram, it's forbidden. What does she want me to say?" Having already revealed herself as a fundamentalist in their previous conversation about polygamy, Karima kept her mouth shut this time. Now, I'll come back to Karima and to the bind in which she finds herself later in the talk. But before I do so, however, I want to bring the two elements, the previous elements of the talk together on the regulation of religion and the regulation of sex. I want to bring these two together to think about these regulatory mechanisms, not simply as parallel modes of secular power, but as far more deeply imbricated. To do so, I want to return to Niput and Soumise and to the series of juxtapositions that they allow us to better examine. As the organization's name suggests, the model of heterofemininity embraced by Niput ni Soumise, neither whores nor donuts, is produced and reproduced through a sexual contrast between the sexually normal musulman laïque and her two sexually abnormal counterparts, the veiled doormat, la soumise, and the whore, la pute. If la soumise represents repressed sexuality and a lack of femininity, la pute, the whore, represents an excessive sexuality that breaches the bounds of proper femininity. Moreover, if the sexual abnormality of the unfashionable soumise emerges from her refusal to participate in consumerist femininity, the pute takes consumerism too far, commodifying her own body. Thus, the semantic juxtaposition enacted by Niput ni Soumise reiterates a broader regulatory regime evidenced by the various laws I mentioned earlier, criminalizing prostitution and veiling. In other words, Niput ni Soumise simply makes explicit a wider secular Republican logic. To be sexually normal and fully secular is to be Niput ni Soumise. That ni, neither nor structure of secular Republican sexuality repeats itself within the figure of la soumise or la musulmane voilée. Consider the lawyer Varro's declaration in the Demiati Fouchelou hearing that the headscarf, if you recall, the headscarf is not simply a religious sign. It is worn to hide the fact that one is a woman, he said. Now, Varro's is a fairly common understanding of the headscarf as hiding or dissimulating the fact of womanhood. In this view, women lose their feminine identity if their bodies cannot be seen. Joan Scott persuasively argues that within Republican ideology, feminine identity depends on male desire, and male desire depends on visual stimulation. Hence the common notion that veiled women, to use Lubna Melian's terms, hide their femininity behind a veil, and in so doing, to use Barreau's terms, they hide the fact that they are women. Sex and gender are collapsed in this interpretation of veiling as hiding the fact that one is a woman. The quality of being a woman depends on one's femininity, which in turn depends on one's normative heterosexuality. And that normative sexuality requires that a woman be uncovered, that she show off her femininity, that she reveal her sex. Yet the demand to exhibit is coupled with a simultaneous demand to hide. On the one hand, mainstream Republican feminists now equate gender equality with sexual emancipation and the visibility of the female body. On the other, many of these feminists have long criticized sexual exhibitionism for reducing women to their sex bodies. Gender equality seemingly depends on some kind of visibility, hence the consistent demand by public school teachers pre-2004 that veiled students, apparently showing too little of themselves, reveal their necks, earlobes, and hairlines as a compromise. But girls should not show too much of themselves either, as demonstrated by the 2003 affaire du string, when some schools began sending home girls whose thong underwear was visible between their low-cut pants and cropped t-shirts. Pundits bemoan the over-sexualization of young women and the way in which, as Socialist Party leader at the time, Ségolène Royal put it, and I quote, the string or thong reduces young girls to behind, unquote. This ambivalent relationship to the sexual visibility of the female body comes together in critiques of the veil. For as much as the veil is thought to hide the fact of one's sex body, it is equally criticized, sometimes by the same detractors, for unnecessarily sexualizing the body and drawing attention to it. A number of critics contend, after all, that veiling contradictorily reveals what it is supposed to hide, namely the sexuality of a woman's body. According to one liberal political theorist, I quote, it reveals by covering the sexuality of the veil the sexuality that must be veiled is performatively construed through the very act of veiling it, unquote. Intended to dissimulate, the veil ends up exposing, and in so doing, it over-sexualizes women, confirming the presence of an inegalitarian gender system based on sexual difference and sexual inequality. This is, of course, a common liberal critique of veiling. Feminist scholar Bronwyn Winter repeats, I believe she's an Australian. Anyway, feminist scholar Bronwyn Winter repeats this contention in her analysis of the hijab controversy in France, examining the close relationship between hair and sexuality across various patriarchal cultural formations. She compares veiled women to, and I quote, models, dancers, singers, strippers, escorts, hostesses, and street sex workers alike who display and toss with practiced nonchalance, often elaborately coiffed locks in a carefully coded performance of titillation. The hijab is a hypersexualizing marker par excellence, unquote. Turning to what she calls the paradoxical nature of the French hijab, Winter approvingly cites Moroccan feminist Maria Barnini, interviewed for Libération, and I quote again, Mrs. Barnini. If one refers to the spirit of the Quran, the veil's objective is that women do not attract attention, are not stared at. Young French women who wear the veil are not, however, doing so to become invisible, but on the contrary, to become visible. The veil does not protect them, it exposes them. There's an odd mix of rebellion, religion, and Star Academy. The Star Academy is a reality show, a kind of combination of Big Brother and American Idol. Drawing on Barnini's assertion, which is a widely shared opinion among secular Republicans and liberals alike, Winter seeks to underscore the ostensibly contradictory nature of the headscarf. Though it attempts to hide the fact that one is a woman, it ends up revealing it in excess of the normal protocols of female sexuality. Interestingly, the veiled woman and the whore are once again juxtaposed here, though this time as analogous figures of hypersexualization. The musulmane voilée becomes et pute et soumise, both whore and doormat. Whether the veil reveals too much or too little, or both too much and too little, Winter's reference to strippers, sex workers, and veiled women invokes the me logic of secular Republican sexuality, in which women must reveal something of their sex bodies, but not too much. Getting that alignment right, revealing neither too much nor too little, being niput nisumis, constitutes, I would argue, the basis of secular Republican sexual normativity. Now, Bahnini's earlier juxtaposition, the headscarf as an odd mix of religion and Star Academy, is also telling. The mix is odd because religion is supposed to be private, not performed in public. Within the conventional Protestant qua-secular definition of religion, religion concerns the transcendental or otherworldly and manifests in ascetic practices if it manifests at all. Within the secular definition of religion, the concern with adornment, and especially with adornment that signals feminine sexuality, is seen as incompatible with religiosity. The notion that religion does not mix with sexuality or femininity underpins the widespread sense among many Republicans and liberals alike that wearing a headscarf with makeup and fashionable clothes is somehow contradictory. The internationally renowned Egyptian feminist Nawal al-Saadawi exemplifies this reaction. Writing about young French women protesting the 2004 law banning religious signs, al-Saadawi dismissively notes that, and I quote, "The young women wearing the veil were often clothed in tight-fitting jeans, their faces covered with layers of makeup, their lips painted bright red, the lashes around their eyes thickened black or blue with heavy mascara," unquote. We, the readers, are left to infer the supposed contradiction between true piety and this kind of feminine sexual adornment, one that signals the apparent inauthenticity of these women's religiosity. The measure of authentic religiosity relies in turn on the common assumption that religion, real religion, does not have any truck with such markers of feminine sexuality. Al-Saadawi's critique reveals how much the secular imperative to define proper religion and proper sexuality relies on and reproduces an oppositional relationship between sex and religion. Religion and sexuality are brought together in this logic to demarcate what is properly religious, that which is not sexual, and what is properly sexual, that which is not religious. This opposition between sex and religion continues to drive the old trope of Islam as far too concerned with sex to be a real religion. Recall Salman Rushdie's 1989 Satanic Verses, for example, and its prophet as pervert narrative. Rushdie's Muhammad, called Mahmoud, is a sexually ravenous clown who, after his first wife's death, sleeps with so many women that his beard turns half white in a year, and who authorizes polygamy as, and I'm quoting from the Satanic Verses, God's own permission to fuck as many women as he liked, unquote. The novel depicts the Quran as essentially a rule book about sexual intercourse where only two positions are legitimate, one of them being, of course, sodomy. The essence of the joke here and the accompanying frisson of mockery arise from Rushdie's juxtaposition of sex and religion. Mahmoud, or Muhammad, is a charlatan because he is so sexually depraved. Rushdie's novel plays on the sense essential to a Christian imaginary from the Crusades onward, and now to a secular imaginary too, that Islam is not a real religion because it authorizes sex, aberrant sex, as a site of pleasure. To return to my overarching point then, secular rule does not simply entail the parallel regulation of sex and religion. Rather, secular religiosity and secular sexuality are constituted and normalized together. Concomitantly, perverse sexuality and perverse religion are also constructed together, hence the common image of the Muslim fundamentalist, not just as a pervert, but as a charlatan too. So let me step back and elaborate briefly now on what I mean by the cunning of secular power, a cunning that I have demonstrated obliquely throughout the talk. Recall Karima's interactions with her boss when she is asked, incited to discourse, we might say, when she's asked about adultery and polygamy. Her experiences illustrate not only the incitement to exhibit one's sexual and religious beliefs and practices that have become a hallmark of secularity, but also the cunning of that incitation. Karima is compelled to talk about sex in order to prove that she's normal. But when she does speak, making public what otherwise would have remained private, namely her views about polygamy and adultery, when she does speak, she reveals herself as existing outside the secular sexual norm. She fails the test. In fact, the test is set up to record women like Karima and Saida Kada as failures of integration, as sexually and religiously abnormal. After all, it is precisely because as veiled women, they are always already suspected of being sexually and religiously abnormal that they must prove otherwise. Yet the fact that they wear the headscarf and therefore subscribe to a sexual ideology different from Republican sexuality, as well as to a set of authoritative norms different from secular religiosity, makes passing that test impossible. Consistently called upon to make public and speak publicly about that which normally remains private, namely their sexual and religious beliefs and practices, veiled Muslim French women cannot but disqualify themselves as not normal, not secular, not French. The cunning of secular power helps then to defer and displace the fundamental tensions of secularism that emerge from its contradictory imperatives to separate and to regulate, to privatize and to surveil. As I've argued, the public discourses and political practices that attempt to regulate sex and religion have as their effect the contravention of the public-private distinction that underpins both normative sexuality and normative religiosity. Secular power constantly trespasses the very boundary that it seeks to erect. The burden of that trespass, however, falls on Muslim French women. Incited by secular authorities to reveal publicly the innermost details of their sexual and religious lives, and then taken to task for doing so, for exhibiting in public that which should be private, that double gesture constitutes the cunning of secular power. Moreover, while there is obviously historical specificity to this process with regard to Muslims in France, the state's competing imperatives to render private and to surveil, and the contradictory incitement to hide and to reveal, have been central to the regulation of other non-normative religious and sexual communities as well, including queers, Mormons, and Jews in France, in the United States, and Britain, I imagine Australia too. What I want to highlight is how much the cunning of secular power serves to displace the burden of trespass onto the non-normative subjects of regulation, who become responsible for the tensions and contradictions of secular rule. Thus, in a masterful dissimulation of the nature of secular rule, it is Muslim French women who are seen to undermine the boundary between public and private, not secular power itself. Now, I want to conclude with a set of questions about this nexus of sex, religion, and secularism, what Joan Scott has rather brilliantly termed sexularism. Is there a particular Christian genealogy to this oppositional relationship between religious piety and sexual pleasure, one that does not exist or is much less pronounced in Islamic and other traditions? If we recognize secularism's Christian inheritance, be it structural or historico-genealogical, how do we then attend to the relationship between Christian protocols about sexuality and secular ones? I'm not arguing for a simple relationship whereby the secular configuration of proper sexuality and proper religiosity is actually Christian. Rather, I'm interested, and I'll end here, I'm interested in how the normative Christian opposition between piety and sexual pleasure may have been reconfigured under secularity, yet in a way that makes the co-articulation of sex and religion foundational to proper sex and proper religion. So I will end here and take questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. I think quite new, perhaps, for a lot of people here, or quite different to the way in which we perhaps approach these topics. I know Gilbert's work is relatively familiar with this kind of area. Rather than me commenting at the moment, I'd rather open the floor. We have, about half an hour for question and answer session before the coffee break. Who would like to begin to?
And I'm curious actually about whether, yes, it was very dense. So if people have questions about the argument, I'm happy to sort of clarify things. But I'm curious about, so maybe I can start with questions.
Great idea.
How much this resonates in Australia and how much it doesn't. Because in France and certainly in Britain and increasingly in the United States as well, there's this sense of Muslim women kind of coming under the auspices of state regulations, certainly discourses about their about the relationship between sex and veil, basically sexuality, like veiling as a sexually non-normative practice, right? Not just a sort of fundamental religious practice, but the kind of the way that quote unquote fundamentalism
becomes both religiously abnormal but also sexually abnormal. And certainly in France, this is part of the argument like Sexuality, right? The sense that Islam is sexually repressive and that women is part of sexual repression.
And I think there's also something here about the role of men and the way in the popular discourse men or Muslim men are portrayed as inadequately sexual in some kind of way, so perversely sexual. And I think there's a lot of that in the Australian youth. People are nodding, I think we're familiar. So I'm also interested in one of the questions I was going to ask you is, how do you see the relationship to the way in which men are constructed? For example, by Muslims in a very particular way after certain incidents in areas that are described as ghettos, and that the whole kind of racialized and sexualized notion of that idea in itself.
But I think there's a kind of logic there too, because Muslim men are configured as both inadequately sexual in the sense that they are, fundamentalist and therefore aren't properly sexual enough, but also configured as hypersexual.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, and it's sort of so both repressive and predatory.
Yeah.
Right. And so hence the discourse of gang rape and domestic violence in the banlieue, that goes side by side with a discourse about repression.
I mean, just to add one more thing to that before I open it up, I was particularly interested in the aftermath of the shootings in Paris recently. All of that spate of articles about the fact that these people had been seen in gay clubs and
drinking.
She was drinking and she was on drugs and she was sexually active and all those types of things, as if that was almost like, and the way I read it was as if that was almost a relief, because it wasn't really emanating from Islam, but it was emanating from some kind of, depravity, then that would be easier for people to understand and conceptualize. So there's a couple of issues there which I think are familiar to us here and might help us to answer your question about how that's perceived here in Australia. But would anybody like to say something?
I remember
Maybe introduce yourself.
Yes, if you could introduce yourself.
I'm I don't know, that's as far as I can. But I think so much of what you're saying resonates in the sense that it's almost like stressful to hear it articulated so clearly because it is so true. Like every time you have an interaction with a person, it is this: first I must justify, and then we can continue to have a normal interaction. If you're satisfied with the fact that I tick all these boxes, and if you're not, then perhaps we won't speak again. Right. Or we will continue to discuss this issue till you're content with an answer that I can give. Right. And so, I mean, I've not really looked at it from a legal perspective. My research is also in sociology, but certainly on a social level, I can see that kind of interaction being so restrictive. You're never allowed to decide the position in which you speak. It is designated to you, and then you either accept it, or you can't actually have interaction.
Right, you have to sort of account for yourself before any kind of actual interaction can begin.
And so much of what you were saying, I was like, oh God, that's my part. And so, yeah.
Thank you. Well, it's an art. I could send you the art. I'm happy to. I'm glad that I'm sad that it resonates, but also glad that I'm not completely.
No, I'm saying. That's all. I love it. Completely resonated.
To introduce
my name's Randa. And it resonated particularly because on my research I interviewed people who profess to either hate Muslims, Islam, so I just loosely put Islam first, but across the spectrum. And probably the more problematic ones are usually, self-declared lefties, sushi and have a friend. So, but one thing that really resonated was time and time again, there was a very common thread among all the participants that the problem that they had with Muslims was how outward their religiosity was, and how they don't wear their religion inside, and it's about having values. I go to church maybe once a month or for a wedding, but religion should be inside you. It shouldn't be something that's exposed. And very quickly, it would lead to the conclusion that it was about being defiant, it was about showing off, it was about being an ideological profession rather than something that had anything to do with spirituality, particularly when it came to Muslim. One thing that resonated was a
particular person that I spoke to, who, when I met him, had the Quran with all his post-it notes, and he read it back to front a million times, he told me, and he was quoting to me without even reading the text. And he said to me, the fact that there are Muslim girls out there with skimpy jeans and makeup proves to me that they're not proper Muslims. That means that it's an ideological act. It proves that it's an act of defiance and not spirituality. And he's disciplining by this atheist who hates religion, as he told me, of Muslim women and the way that they choose to wear their veiling. And just the misogyny, patriarchy that's implicit in his disciplining them in the name of secularism was so wrong.
Right. I mean, I think you touched on a couple of things that I really was trying, and I'm trying to do in my research, which is to, the first thing is that, a lot of Islamophobia is actually, certainly in France, Islamophobia of the left, right? So it's not a kind of, and it's precisely about being too publicly religious. And so it's a kind of committed secular Islamophobia. It's not the Islamophobia of the Front National, which is just kind of rampantly, anti-immigrant, white power, right? It's not the Islamophobia of Donald Trump in the U.S. It's a very different kind of an attitude that doesn't recognize itself as in any way racist or as in any way problematic,
And also effectively known for anti-racist.
right? And actually,
Properly anti-racist.
properly anti-racist, right? And so one of the things that I'm really trying to do, both in the book and in this article, is to just kind of unsettle the understanding of secularism as a space of neutrality, right? As a kind of redemptive space of leftist neutrality, and to really think about it as a site of regulation, because secular religion or secularism is a very, very clear understanding of what is proper religion. And what's interesting is how much in France that relies on an understanding of proper sexuality. And so that's partly what I was trying to do in this talk, is kind of really try to unpack in a clear way what I think is going on. And the second thing that you said is related, which is about the leftist secular imperative to keep religion private or inside. But what's interesting is, coupled with that is also a real fear that Muslims will be too invisible. And this really resonates with European anti-Semitism as well, right? And so one of the kind of the anxieties of a number of politicians in the media is that it's about Islam de cave, right? Basement Islam, where Muslims are practicing in the basement, like in these places that you can't recognize as Muslim spaces or as mosques that aren't visible. And so again, it's this very ambivalent relationship to visibility, where you can't be too visible, but you can't be too invisible either, right? You have to religion has a proper place, and it can only be in that place. And it's very similar to 19th century fears about Jews, about French Jews, and with kind of Jewish emancipation, there was this this sort of sense that like Jews couldn't be too publicly Jewish, and they had to remove all of the sartorial and signs of their Jewishness. But there was also a fear that that they couldn't have services or any sort of religious practice in spaces that weren't clearly designated as synagogues. Right, and so there's a kind of, so I one of the other talks I give is actually trying to map this point about visibility and invisibility in sex onto the politics of visibility when it comes to architecture as well, and urban space, where Muslims are not supposed to be too visible. They're not supposed to pray in the street. They're supposed to pray in their designated spots, but they shouldn't be. But you need to know who they are, right? Like they can't be too invisible either. And so there's a really interesting and very ambivalent politics of visibility when it comes to religion.
But it really speaks to that kind of notion of the proper division between the public and the private, because of course this notion that you can do what you want in private, but you shouldn't do it in public, is completely violated when you want to actually regulate, your Islam across the board, be it in your home, in your basement, or on the street, or in the mosques, or in the school, indeed, from the premier side.
Which really shows it's not the rhetoric is public-private, but ultimately the goal is to reduce your capacity to be a Muslim, whether in public or private, and that's really the objective.
Right, and be Muslim in a very constrained, proper way that is always already impossible I mean, I would argue that that the notion of religion that's at work here is profound Christian, right? And so, you know, Muslims, Jews, whomever, are never actually going to fulfill that image of proper religiosity because the form that their religion takes is always going to be outside of that box. And one of the things I think I would argue that happens with Jewish emancipation and the kind of integration and secularization of Jews is that then, you know, private Jews become racialized. Right? As opposed, I mean, the sort of the race-religion split starts to operate there, and I think the same thing, you see very similar processes going on, and how do you with Muslims and Islam?
Take this in the whole direction.
Sorry, yes.
I want to do it now. Yeah, who would like to say something?
And if you have questions about the actual argument, I know it's a dense paper. It's also available as a blog post. To anyone if you want to read it.
I have a question.
Yes.
I was reading into it. First, it was fantastic. And we don't have to talk about it. We've got around it as well. I wanted to know a bit more about your idea of cunning music. And in particular, if you saw that as related to, in any way, the
Yeah, so Elizabeth Pavanelli was on my committee as a graduate student, so it's very definitely related to her cunning of recognition, but it's a similar kind of, mechanism at work, a similar kind of logic. And so for those of you, is everyone familiar with the cunning of recognition? I mean, it's about Australian multiculturalism. So, but the argument there is essentially that Indigenous people are sort of forced to reveal them, or that political and legal recognition depends on their being sort of properly Indigenous and traditional. But if they really reveal themselves to be properly Indigenous and traditional in ways that don't sit with, you know, liberal values, moral values, then of course they cannot be recognized as legitimate political legal subjects, right? So it's a very, for me, you know, rereading Pavanelli's work, I started to think, wow, there's something quite similar at work here as well. And so then I think the question becomes, or at least a question worth thinking through, maybe during the roundtable, is, you know, how much of this is about just state power and governmentality, right? And how much of this is about secularism? So if Pavanelli's writing about multiculturalism and multicultural recognition, and I'm writing about kind of secular recognition, I think the question then, you know, what's the relationship between secularism, multiculturalism, recognition? Is it actually about minorities and state power? Is it about secularism and modernity? Is it about multiculturalism and liberalism? What here is related? What is purely similar? And what is quite different? And I still haven't quite wrapped my head around that question, or I haven't figured out an answer to that. Because I think the thing that was also interesting for me, I mean, I've mentioned the examples of Jewish, of anti-Semitism and the regulation of Jews, but obviously the regulation of, you know, of gay and lesbian communities operates in a very similar way, right? Where one cannot, in fact, be a private citizen because one's sex is always already. Right? And so there's a similar compulsion to both hide one's abnormality and reveal it at the same time. And so I think there's something more general here than just Islam and Muslims. But at the same time, I think there is something about, certainly in this present moment, right, there is something about Islam that is specific. And I think also that the relationship between policy and proper religion gets wrapped. I think the question of secularism emerges there in a different kind of way. But perhaps not. I mean, I don't, you know, because of course the part of Pavanelli's argument is also about sexuality, right, and indigenous sexualities. So
I'm just wondering though, in the current moment, if there's any way in which to be properly Muslim in the way that there's this kind of narrow, I think what Kavina is saying, this like extremely narrow and circumscribed and foreclosed way of being Aboriginal, which is basically if your culture can be commodified in some kind of way, right? And I'm just wondering whether today there's any way, any part of Islam can be recuperated for the common good. I mean, there's this notion of the moderate Muslim, and I think this is something Yassir works on a lot, which I think perhaps is that space, but it's so circumscribed and foreclosed. Maybe that's the paradigm.
Yes.
And, you know, at the moment in Australia, there's very, very tough fights going on around forced closures of communities, things I'm not sure that you've heard of, where I think it's all about, I mean, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott rejected it, the kind of a lifestyle choice. If you want to live in a remote community, that's a kind of lifestyle choice. And I think it's the same way in which Muslims are being spoken to. Well, if you want to live hijab, then that's your lifestyle choice, but we're not going to help you and include you in any kind of way. And you will be cut off in the same way that Aboriginal people are being, their services are literally going to be cut off. So I don't know, there's maybe scope for Lara.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great thing. I'm just wondering, I'm wondering if between that discussion and I'm wondering if they also talk about reproduction, so sexuality and then the regulation of reproduction in sex, where I think places like Australia, ability to reproduce actually has been very much concerning and very much connected to the regulation of sexuality, indigenous and also pastoral. So I'm wondering if that comes into
It's a great question. I think it does. I haven't quite worked on the question of sort of, actual reproduction as opposed to social reproduction. But certainly there is a lot of criticism of the big family, right? Especially of polygamous families that are thought to be even bigger and sort of overrunning the banlieue. And I remember during the 2005, the kind of urban uprisings / riots after the electrocution of those two boys in a power station. They were running from the police, and their death set off kind of massive urban uprisings. And one of the arguments was that part of the problem of the banlieue was simply too many children than parents could look after. And so that was part of a larger discourse about over-reproduction, certainly. So it's very much tied in. In terms of, I haven't looked into the actual legal regulation though of reproduction and welfare and immigration and things like that. But it's certainly something that I would probably need to do. So it's both a great question and maybe a good way to keep going with this project.
Well, I mean, places like Australian migration is very much very much so reproduction to migration is very much so migrant women were very much history of Australian policies very much screened to that and to reproduce them after they distribute
Yeah, and there's certainly also, it maps onto this conversation. There's a lot of talk about, and part of being properly integrated is also, having romantic relationships and sexual relationships with white men, right? Muslim women, white men, Muslim men, white women less so. But there is a kind of discourse of mixité, right? And part of having men and women together in social spaces, but there's also, again, it's really ambivalent because on the one hand, there's all of this anxiety about fraudulent marriages and green card marriages and marriages between immigrants and nationals that are the site of a lot of suspicion. But there's also a way in which Republican integration, really also, but certainly a kind of left Republican integration, one of the signs of that is to be part of a mixed race couple, right? And I remember, when I was there doing field work, a lot of French people were often really critical of if they had been to the U.S. They were all inevitably there would always be this sort of there are no interracial, there's so few interracial couples, but here in France you see all these interracial couples, and so interracial couples is a real site of both anxiety and also redemption in some ways, because it signals both the success of the integrated subject, but also the success of the republic in in promoting the kind of values of kind of liberal Republican. Does that, I mean, is that the case here as well? Is there a sort of investment in the interracial couple, or?
This is almost there's a fascination in finding that whole context. So
Yeah.
yeah, so there's some fascinating work on that. She also looks at you from a geographic perspective and the role of interest in public space. And as a successor, most popular than as an anxiety.
Right. So
it kind of like is whiteness being washed out from Australia.
right. What's her last name? Natasha?
Yeah. I think she's also making more work on that. If anyone's interested in
No, thanks.
Yeah, since you compare the degree in dealing with Jews and Muslims in time, I'm just wondering to what extent are Jewish women as well subject to this same curiosity, because religious Jewish women have to cover
Right.
all the rest. Is there a discourse around that, or is it a completely exemplary, they kind of feel significant?
That's a great question, and you might be able to answer this too. But my sense is no, they don't come in for the same scrutiny, suspicion, and I think there are lots of reasons for that. I mean, part of it is I think after basically post World War II, France has a very different relationship to its Jewish community than it does to its Muslim community. And so I don't think that practicing Orthodox Jewish women come in for anywhere near the same scrutiny. And it's similar to the question of Jewish private schools, for example, right, which don't pose any problem. Ostensibly don't pose any problem to the French state, and many of them are publicly funded. I mean, they're sort of funded by the state, just as Catholic schools are, but Muslim schools are presented in a very different kind of way. But I think it would be historically. I haven't read enough. The synagogue example that I was using. I mean, that's the one I'm most familiar with. Constraint politics of visibility. But it would be interesting, I think, to think historically.
Family side as well.
Yeah.
Because in Palestine,
Yeah.
they were Israel. The problem, large families are Palestinians and Orthodox.
Right.
Palestinians as well for problem.
Right.
But right.
But in
It
France,
has to do
not
with
so
class.
much.
It has to do with class, maybe. Maybe they don't give the one.
They do. I mean, it's not necessarily. It is certainly a class thing, but it's not the kind of the Sephardic population in France is not necessarily of a different class. I mean, slightly, but not really. No. I think there's just a lot of trepidation thinking and talking about Jews, period, except in a kind of phylosemetic way, right? Except in a sort of model minority. Well, the Jews integrated, why can't you? Right? In sense. That's what.
But the Jews are also used as a kind of a counterpoint to Muslims quite purposefully by the elite and the state, in the sense that Muslims are portrayed as the primary perpetrators of anti-Semitism, and the state and the Christian elites in France are completely exempt, and it's almost the Holocaust, which all of this is in reference to. But it didn't have to happen because the real anti-Semites are the Muslims and the Arabs. So I think it's quite interesting to note how that's kind of a re-racialization of Jews, despite the fact that they have this favorite status, but at the same time as being held up as this kind of, as you say, model minority, although I'm not even sure that they need to integrate. I mean, there's that whole kind of class of assimilated Jews who have integrated, but then Orthodox Jews can slip by the wayside by proxy, as it were, because of this massive threat of anti-Semitism, which of course then the white French state is the savior, right? Completely excising the fact that they sent them to their deaths.
Right, because it's a lot easier to make that argument when the French state killed some people, right? It's just, I mean, it's a sort of, but I would argue that there's a similar thing going on also with group communities, right? Where the state sort of exempts the state and Catholics. And for those of you who are going to be there for the workshop, I have a chapter on this in my book about the discourse of Muslim homophobia. which operates very similarly to the discourse of Muslim anti-Semitism, but which exempts the state and Catholic homophobes or the entire kind of structure of heteronormativity on which France is based from any kind of extreme, because Muslims are
So I've got a quick comment on that. The discourse of Muslims and Semites reminded me of the example of, I'm not familiar with all of his work, Gilbert.
Gilbert.
Yeah. And the reception is kind of, I forget in which case it was, but it was a critique of French intervention Somalians, and how it kind of operates in a similar way to what you're talking about with I guess the impossibility of the kind of Muslim figure being put on the spot to kind of account for their wearing of the veil, to kind of, I guess, be interpolated in that acceptable sexual subjectivity, and that kind of in turn really, I guess, is apparent in discussions around intervention, question of Israel here in Australia, with, and I'm sure a lot of people have thought about this a lot lately with the remarks of the Grand Mufti surrounding the response to the Paris attacks, Zaki Mallah in Q&A a while ago, where any kind of, I guess, recourse to the role of Western intervention in kind of forming the kind of intractable conflicts in the Middle East is marked as unacceptable kind of discourse for Islamic leaders or leaders to say, but at the same time they're being called out to say something. So there's an impossibility, like, you're not saying like our Prime Minister or ex-Prime Minister recently kind of said.
Yes, I saw.
Sorry?
I saw it was in the newspaper today.
Yeah,
that Islam has to reform.
Well, that's an echo of a previous comment that he made, is that that was really quiet. I think it was about 6 months ago, where he said, I wish that Islamic leaders would come out and condemn extremism and mean it. So there's that possibility there too, you know, like, so if you come out and condemn it, but qualify with a reference to maybe, you know, what the head of the Australian Federal Police has said, the head of the CIA has said, that intervention is actually what, you know, Muslim people to be quite angry about the fact that Western armies are in. So any reference to that is impossible, but it's impossible to be quiet as well. You just have to condemn. I guess that's the impossible space in the arena of foreign policy. I just found that quite, what you were talking about, sexual subjectivity, running true in that area as well.
Right, and this idea that you can say it, but you have to mean it.
Yeah.
Right, and then
One thing to cross their hearts.
right, but it's that, it's the penetration into the internal, like, reading of the inside, right, the need to read the inside, and not just, and that somehow they're, like, the outside doesn't quite, you know, it's not enough.
This is where it's fundamentally about race, I think, because there's this notion of duplicitousness where, that whole Stuart Hall's idea of the genetic code. So no matter how you present yourself on the outside, your inside reveals your inner truth, which is, of course, the racial essence, which I think here is. So it doesn't matter how much Muslim professors to love the state and to hate extremism and, all of this, and they can take their hijab off and they can never go to the mosque and they can eat pork, but they will still remain at their core duplicitous and racially other.
Well, we were talking about this earlier, but Donald Trump's recent call, right, for the end of immigration of Muslims, basically, a ban on immigration of Muslims. But how does one measure that? Like, just in terms of, like, okay, let's say he becomes president and he institutes a ban. What, is there going to be a religion test at the border? And what exactly are you going to ask? Are you Muslim? And what if the person says no? Right? I'm Christian. I'm agnostic. I don't know. I'm an atheist. It's exactly that, right? Being Muslim is not ultimately about what one professes or what one exhibits. It really is about the kind of influence, at least in Trump's formulation there. And I think you can see. Yeah.
We highlighted that already in Australia in response to the Syrian refugees. We wanted to say, at one point they were kind of more about just being Christian, and then they kind of flushed it to religious or minorities and believe in that. What I was interested in your perspective on though was more about the relationship between changes in where sexual which in the United States in particular, well, that was a big moment, and Islamophobia, which I know, but it strikes me as that the connections there are kind of reveal a lot. I remember jokes at the time that America, I don't know the laws of change, whatever, but this huge overflowing kind of exuberance, graduation things happening, and there were jokes being made by the girls about Islamophobia, sure, go to Iran. That's it, that's what you do, you should go to Iran. And had two things happening on social media spaces. You had Australians being very awkward and saying, well, we kind of not like, we still have the consent of marriage, so we're giving this kind of racial geography, racial sexual geography. And you had queer activists in Iran saying, don't, one, be racist, two, what is the word? We don't want you to
Right. Well, I think,
At the same time, you have Australian detention camps where people were fleeing sexual persecution and are put into sites of extreme sexual violence. And so you've got these
yeah, I think the relationship between discourses about, or the relationship between homophobia and Islamophobia is a really interesting connection, and I think it can go in lots of different directions. I write about this in France. What was striking to me was how there the argument about same-sex marriage, because obviously France legalized same-sex marriage a few years ago, fully. Except, although there are all kinds of restrictions around immigration, of course. But what was really striking to me was how the opposition to same-sex marriage and same-sex adoption on the part of white Christians or post-Christian, basically the center-right party opposed the legalization of same-sex marriage, how that was understood as a political conflict rather than a clash of moral values, or certainly not a clash of civilizations, right? Whereas Muslim opposition to same-sex marriage, to same-sex adoption is always configured as both a citizenship deficit and also civilization deficit. And there are certainly calls. So it's interesting because my guess is that the calls for sort of Christian homophobes to go to Iran is in some ways a joke. No one actually thinks that they should be shipped off to Iran. But the calls for Muslims who have criticized same-sex marriage or homosexuality, those calls are actually real. And imams have, in fact, been deported for their views about women and gays, right? So it's a very different kind of practice. And the other interesting thing, too, is that the conviction on the part of many progressive leftist members of the Socialist Party and various progressive parties that their political opponents would eventually change their mind, right? And that Christians will eventually come around to the fact that homosexuality. And that kind of temporal generosity is just not given to Muslims, right? It's now or never, right? And so there's a kind of really different organization of space and time in the logic, in the way in which, in the discourse of Muslim homophobia. So Catholic opponents of same-sex marriage are understood, no one ever questions their Europeanness or their Frenchness, right? They're a political problem and a political liability, but they're not of a different civilization or a different geographical space. So there's a kind of spatial organization of that, and then there's also a way in which time is given to Christians and Christian homophobes to change, and there's a conviction that they eventually will evolve, right, in a way that is absolutely not given to Muslim communities and friends. And so I think that's one way to kind of think about the relationship between think about the relationship between Muslims and sort of questions of same-sex marriage and sexual oppression, which I think is valuable to sort of take apart, like what is actually going on here.
I also think that time
Mm-hmm.
that had a sense of that part of a sense of progress that
Yes.
is closer to being.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that is there in the sense of the embarrassment of Australia, saying that are we closer to Iran or are we left behind
Right.
in this kind of grand story of progress?
The implication being that that couldn't possibly be the case because Australia is just.
Well, it's always like Australia's always worried about this.
Right.
We're always worried about things. But it's kind of like it's a problem.
Right.
Which if we get too close to these racialized.
What happens when anti-sex thing?
Right, and there's a way too in which Muslims who are totally accepting of same-sex marriage are always understood as the exception, never the rule. Whereas sort of white homophobes are understood as the exception, who will eventually come in, right? But there's no, and it's a similar way around the integrated subject too. I think there's these sort of women who are good integrated sexual subjects are always understood as the exception, rather than as any kind of common sociological.
It'll be very interesting to see in Australia where I think same-sex marriage will probably pass in the next couple of years, whether this whole kind of law on citizenship, the revocation of citizenship, where they want to basically take citizenship away if they are not displaying proper Australian values, whether it will be applied to people. I doubt that will be the case. I think we should probably take a break. It's 11:10. I'd like to thank Mayanthi very much for opening the discussion up. Take about half an hour or so, just have a coffee, tea, chat, and then we'll have the opportunity to come back at the end after Yassir and Gilbert's papers to discuss how they work together.
Thanks. It's in signs, but if you send me an email, I'll send you
Sorry to interrupt you. I was sort of emails about Intimacies in the middle of the day, so I just wanted to come say thank you so much for organising this.
Thank you.
It's so awesome. If I wanted to get to read the article,
Yeah, it's one of these plugs as Alana, I'm just going to run outside and take credit grade. Should I get a card? Yes. Do you want a copy?
It's basically when as indigenous behavior, so once traditional people also
doing often just have to give exemptions for them.
Oh, I see.
Do you want me to do all you would want?
Yeah.
We'll go that way. Actually, I want to catch you on the.
Oh, I see.
Relocate. If you want, you can relocate. Will it reach to this table here?
I was thinking my school.
So then I'll move my stuff. Okay, so let's relocate. Yeah, and then I'll go.
Do you want it to be seen on the screen?
But I mean, if you want, alternatively, I can change the. I can sit there anyway. Just give you a sign. I can change the slide for you. He confused me part of this. He confused me part of this. Testing. He made it look like they actually don't fit. What I think they actually might be fit. I see my course do that all the time.
Yes, that was your. Sorry.
I said I hope he has enough time.
Oh yeah, this one is not till 2:30.
Oh, okay. I'm just step outside and warm up.
It's free here.
It's free. It's always the same. Isn't it? I always say to them, fine, that's very good. Just in the beginning.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's right. It's
It's always applying actually to people who
yeah, I mean, part of this is kind of explanation of top of the yeah. Well, this is okay.
So it is like for me, it's empirical side research. He also has so I guess one thing, so the first increasing. So those are kind of my
Okay, welcome back. We're now going to have two papers, first from Gilbert Caluya and then from Yassir Morsi. Gilbert is an ARC DEFRA Fellow at the Centre for Muslim and Non-Muslim Australia, and is soon to be moving to the University of Melbourne. Gilbert is the person responsible for this workshop, for financing it, and for organising many of the practical details, and also together with Yassir and myself, for bringing it together. So thank you so much for that. Kind of a DIY team here, as you can see, trying to manage all the technical and and the intellectual details at the same time. Gilbert's paper is going to be on domestic terrorism, Muslim domesticities, and the Dhamma politics of counter-terrorism. So speak for about, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes, and then maybe we'll just take a couple of questions and then go to Yassir, and then we'll bring everybody together with Mayanthi also for a final discussion. Great.
Fantastic.
Yes,
Yeah.
apparently.
Live streamed. Thank you very much all for coming. Thank you very much to Mayanthi and Yassir and Alana for organising this with me. It's been really exciting. I'm just going to go straight into it. It's very nerve-wracking to come straight after Mayanthi's talk, so that's why I have more pictures just to help me out. Cheering squad. And let's go to the next screen. So the term domestic terrorism is increasingly being used in Australia to draw attention to domestic violence in Australia's context. A recent poll conducted on behalf of Fair Agenda found that 74% of Australians said that domestic violence is as much or important as terrorism. It was Bernard Keane, politics editor for Crikey.com, who first brought this argument to Australia's public attention in an article published on the anniversary of the attacks on the World Trade Center in 2014. As Keane astutely pointed out, at the time the Australian government had just announced a $670 million increase in anti-terrorism funding. And this was on top of the existing funding of ASIO, it's $450 million, the Australian Federal Police at $1.4 billion, annual budget, etc., etc. As he pointed out, not all of this was directly for counter-terrorism funding per se. However, you should also take into account the fact that a number of states have also put funding into counter-terrorism projects and programs. So altogether, there's a significant amount of funding for that area. In early 2015, a campaign called Terror at Home was launched in regional Queensland, again to address and end domestic and family violence. And perhaps the most memorable moment this year was Australian of the Year Rosie Batty, who brought to public attention during her National Press Club speech on the 2nd of June 2015, when she called for a greater and more substantial funding to address domestic violence. She said, "We have to clearly put some substantial funding into this issue. You know, amazing the response is when we describe terrorism and there's any slight threat to terrorism, the amazing response we see. So, you know, let's start calling it family terrorism. And perhaps we should start to see that investment and funding being applied where it needs to be." So while progressive politics in Australia, I think, often is using this kind of argument, both to sort of highlight DV's the issue here, and also trying to shift away from these homophobic approaches of counter-terrorism practices, it does, I think, tend to align a number of different ways in which domesticity and terrorism often are interlinked. For starters, it fails to recognise how Muslim women and girls are often portrayed under Islamophobia as particularly prone to domestic victimisation, even while they often not adequately serviced in a number of DV services we have across Australia. And furthermore, the relationship between political violence, that is terrorism here, and domestic violence is often complicated in a number of different ways, which resource competition doesn't really address. Political turmoil, for example, often imposes quite considerable constraints on women experiencing domestic violence, creating fewer and fewer opportunities for them to resist that violence within the home or to seek opportunities elsewhere. Obviously, human services are affected if you're in a war zone, etc., etc. So there's a number of different ways these things are aligned. Today, what I want to talk about is the home as an intimate site for the intimate elaboration of state violence, and particularly in counter-terrorist and counter-insurgency efforts. As cultural geographers remind us, the home is a place that offers security, familiarity, nurture. It is invested with meanings and emotions, experiences and relationships, this we all know, but it also makes the home and the familial relations and kinship networks it is enmeshed within a site for leveraging quite intimate forms of violence. In particular, I'm interested in Muslim domesticities as a structural experience within which domicide is increasingly a widespread phenomenon. And domicide here, I'm talking about the deliberate destruction of the home in pursuit of political ideals. I mean that both as a physical thing, but also symbolic. So I'm also interested in forms of symbolic
domicide or psychological domicide. And here I'm talking about making Muslim homes feel unsafe, unhoming Muslim prisoners, forcing them to leave their homes through other coercive means. I'm speaking here about making Muslims homeless or stateless within war and conflict, but I'm also interested in things like criminalization of familial relations, criminalization of kinship relations, and also increasingly in the use of family members as a kind of proxy prison guards. So through practices of home detention, what you're actually forcing Muslim families to do is act as prison guards, who were then subjected to a number of series of other regulations around their own behaviour. So you're really extending incarceration to a number of different kinds of other practices. In 2009, during the opening of a new school in Afghanistan, Greg Mortensen, a humanitarian campaigner, described in Domestic Image to award-winning journalist Thomas Friedman as a fantasy of a future emancipated Afghan home life. Quote, when a girl learns how to read and write, one of the first things she does is teach her own mother. The girls will bring home meat and veggies wrapped in newspapers, and the mother will ask the girl to read the newspaper to her. And the mothers will learn about politics and about women who are exploited. So this is him imagining, he's a humanitarian who's received millions of dollars in funding to establish schools for Afghan girls. This is during the war and terror. In Mortensen's romanticized imagining of intimate Muslim feminine relations, the Afghan mother does not learn about politics from the series of Gulf Wars or the war of terror. She does not learn of suffering from the current invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan at that time. She does not learn about exploitation through the continued inequality of wealth distribution in the global finance scape. Instead, in Mortensen's fantasy, the Muslim mother can only learn through the mediation of her daughter's Western secular education provided by Western funding through humanitarian processes. So her exploitation is in fact evacuated from her body, displaced from her experience of oppression, only to be made transparent by the filter of the Western media, read back to her ignorant mind by her newly Western educated daughter. This is a kind of Unheimlich feminist fantasy, I'd suggest, because what it's really doing is it's dressed in the interests and politics and issues of feminism, women's education, girls' education, women's exploitation, but often inhabits it in ways which actually are often not useful to women. So it's an uncanny re-rendering of quite a normative feminine relation, I suppose. What is missing from this picture of the liberated Muslim women's education is the war itself. The artillery, the soldiers, the bullets, the dead bodies, the curfews, the military occupation. What I'm missing are dead and maimed siblings, cousins, parents, lovers, children. What I'm missing are homes destroyed by bomb blasts, the insecurity generated by regular raids, by military squadrons into their home, the lineups at gunpoint, screaming women, bloody noses, fathers hooded and handcuffed behind their backs and driven away to unknown locations, often for years on end. In short, Nolan's fantasy of Muslim homely life does not recognize the violent interruption of war and conflict and economics into that space. So here is another image of the war and terror offered by journalist James Gabriel. He gives an example of another incident where these men were celebrating in a home the birth of a child, and they hear a commotion outside. One of the men walks out and is shot straight away. The brother and three women from the party tried to drag the body back inside, and immediately they're also shot. So they're all killed within a few minutes. Very quickly it becomes clear, because the American soldiers move in, that it's actually Americans. They had thought it was the Taliban coming to get them. The American soldiers then proceeded to take the bullets out of their body using knives to remove the evidence from what occurred. The men were handcuffed, they were taken away, they were questioned. It was found out that the men were actually very strong allies of the Americans. They were actually policemen and lawyers, and they had been involved in the prosecution of a number of Taliban in that region. So this is the kind of escalation of violence that's really occurring in that region. This was during the war on terror. This is the context of Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., where a number of different policies emerged around 2009 in particular, which used home raids as the primary mechanism for locating terrorists in that region. So these raids, which are regularly occurring between midnight and 5 a.m., and what they're trying to do is often to catch them off guard in their sleep. This is a regular occurrence. And so this is from Sergeant John Bruns, who at the time estimates, he estimates he was involved in about 1,000 home raids in Baghdad, and he was also involved in Abu Ghraib. So here's his explanation of what occurs, and I'll just read it to you. So you leave one rifle team outside while one rifle team goes inside. You go up the stairs, you grab the man at the house. You rip him out of bed in front of his wife. You put him up against the wall. Your junior level troops, they take specialists and run around other rooms and grab the entire family, rip them all together. You then go into a room and you tear the room to shreds and you make sure there's no weapons or anything they can use to attack us. You get the interpreter and you get the man at the home and you have him at gunpoint and you ask the interpreter to ask him, do you have any weapons? Do you have any anti-US propaganda? Anything at all, anything in here that would lead us to believe that you are somehow involved in insurgent activity. Now, of course, if they aren't insurgents, they would say no and they would tell the truth. If they are insurgents, they would say no because they're insurgents and they would be lying. So regardless, they'll say no, and this is what they do afterwards. So what you'll do is you'll take their sofa couch and you'll dump them. If he has a couch, you turn the couch upside down. You'll go into the fridge. If he has a fridge, you throw everything onto the floor. And you'll take his drawers and you'll dump them all on the floor. You'll open up his closet, you'll throw all the clothes on the floor, and basically leave his house looking like a hurricane just hit it. And if you find something, then you'll detain him. But if not, you'll say, sorry to disturb you, have a nice evening. So if you just humiliate this man in front of his entire family, and you go next door and you do the same thing again and again to 100 homes in a row. So these images, if you just go to the next three, instances of recent terror raids in Australia. And so what we're seeing increasingly is that these kinds of experiences are leaking into the domestic space of Australia, UK, America. Home raids are the primary mechanism through which counter-terrorism forces are involved in counter-terrorism efforts, which says something about the imagining of these kind of things. So they're not caught in their workplaces, they're not caught in the act, they're often caught in their homes within these family contexts. And I'm suggesting that what this tends to do is to develop an ongoing experience through which Muslims across the world begin to develop sympathies and affective resonances about this kind of experience.
Oh, another 10 minutes.
Okay, fantastic. And so this is the Obama Situation Room famous photo. So this is when during the home raid of Osama bin Laden. And so one of the major things I'm interested in, and so I'm bringing a lot of data now so that we can talk about stuff in the roundtable as well. But one of the things I'm interested in is the ways in which the mediatization of these home raids actually becomes part of our popular culture. So actually we're increasingly invited to be part of this home raid system that show that video I showed you, the sort of night cam vision of soldiers raiding homes, that kind of stuff pops up time and time again. It's also being used in sort of war porn sites. So a lot of soldiers will sort of send these sorts of images to each other, often images of them shooting Muslims, which is part of the fun of those sort of videos. So what's occurring is that in a sort of more global sense, media is playing a central role in inviting us to participate in the invasion of Muslim homes as part of the success story of counterterrorism. So we are meant to feel that we are doing something, that something is happening, and that we should be celebrating this. Recall that the killing of Osama bin Laden inside his home, often that story is told in ways that try to belittle him in relationship to women in the house. So the idea that he was sort of hiding is sort of part of that kind of story of, the coward, like that these people really actually aren't real enemies, they're actually cowards on the inside. So gender plays a central role in mediating that kind of relationship. And that's again part of the compound. So you have a number of different images where these sorts of things are released. This was released by the US Department of State, which is then newspapers in particular will sort of run stories describing every single step that happens. So they'll have details of like 305, the plane crashed here, etc. So again, part of that is about this sort of geographical imagining about subjects. And so the next series of images, basically what we're seeing here is a number of different drone strikes. So we're talking about the complete decimation of a number of Muslim homes using drone strikes. The use of drones have increased homicide, obviously, amongst Muslim households by US military in countries in which America is not even at war. And so what we're really doing is extending war to a number of areas in which we're technically at peace. So as several studies have pointed out, the majority of casualties in these instances of drone strikes are actually civilians. And one of the reasons for this is that in the early period, the drone strikes primarily targeted assassinations against residential complexes. So unsurprisingly, residential complexes often contain a lot of women and children, which is what has led to a number of civilian casualties. And so I just want to end here on the point that Muslim homes are in many ways the kind of front line of continuing war and terror, both here and abroad. And I know that I haven't touched on all the things I wrote at the start, we can discuss this later. But in many ways, their destruction also indexes a number of different changes in security practices and relations. So the home is a kind of symbolic place and as a physical structure of ontological security is mobilized and exploited in transnational geographies of war and conflict. And so tracing the home as a recurring theme across Western nations and various theatres of war, what I'm trying to take a look at is the kind of slippery boundaries between the intimate and political geographies, between domopolitics, the politics of the home, and geopolitics as culturally intertwined. Thank you.
Are you happy to take 5 minutes of questions now? I think it would be useful. Yes. Would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Lisa. I'm doing a PhD at the University of Sydney. Good, so good. I just wanted to get your thoughts on something. Sorry, I had to write down the cookies. I was really excited because I saw the resonance of this. That recent incident, I guess, in California, and how there was suspected terror. And I don't actually know what came out of it, but it was interesting because I was looking on the BBC and they had all the reporters in the home. And it seemed so weird that they were looking at every room in that home, and they're looking at the kitchen, they're looking at the living room. And a friend of mine pointed out that, you know, it's the audience's, it seemed to be the audience's ability to pathologize, because the things that they were looking at, particularly, for example, in the kitchen, was that maybe she had these Weight Watcher wrappers, and they're like, she was on Weight Watchers, like, how could she do, you know? So I just kind of want to get your thoughts on that. It's so interesting.
They're crazy, right? So, I mean, I would say that there are differences, although in many ways not, between counterterrorism as an official practice of the state and counterterrorism as a sort of popular discourse and the way that we discuss and represent it. Often they're actually quite intertwined, actually. And so, you know, I think that, you know, security elite would quickly sort of dismiss that kind of psychologizing, right, as being sort of popular, gossipy kind of stuff. And yet, the very same kinds of psychologizing practices are occurring within counterterrorism efforts. The shift towards radicalization, in particular as a discursive, as a concept and then as a discourse, is really about shifting away from the act of terrorism towards a whole series of social, psychological, familial contexts, right, which all then become part of pre-crime of terrorism. So everything then can become criminalized, right? So, you know, things like, you know, did they have psychological issues? Were they upset with their body? Did she feel overweight? Did that contribute to the psychological state? So all of these sorts of questions about the psychological state of individual Muslims then gets read back into the act, such that the act appears as a direct result of these psychological and hence internal, not political responses. Right? So it's part, the psychologization of the crime is part of an attempt to move it away from any political discussion about what's actually occurring.
Which is quite interesting, considering those analogies that are always drawn between the lone wolf shooter as being mentally unstable and Muslim terrorists as always having political motivation. So what you're saying kind of disturbs that binary sometimes.
Yeah, I think, so I understand that argument, but so the argument is about trying to show that there's a double standard that's at play. I think we should be careful of then thinking that psychology is is the best way forward for us. It's necessarily progressive discourse. It's to point out that the discrepancies, what we should to point out that it's racist.
Yeah. And they
Yes, yes.
yeah, who was first? Sorry, I was looking. Mayanthi?
Well, I'm going to be at the come around here, so why don't we do questions?
So Lala?
Yeah, thank you. That's fine. It very much connected to some of what we're historically, very much looking at what was happening in Israel, for example, about what running World War II. So when you have a security system that was implemented and you have the infiltration of basic security system within communities and rates, rating components was very familiar from Israeli economics historically. And I did similar things to your website to look at.
It's the movement of the practices between security personnel, military, and private security. So that the same, and police force, so the militarization of police essentially. So you have a circulation of actual techniques as being central to it.
Yeah.
Then the other part of it I think that's interesting is also the sort of highly mediatized environment where these home raids actually become attached to various kinds of media, almost like a reality TV context, which I think adds a new dimension that is difficult to sort of analyze politically except through sort of critiques of voyeurism. But I actually think it's more than that. I think it constitutes our political in many different ways. And that's what allows us to begin to identify with security rather than the victims.
Maybe time for
I guess, sorry, from our viewpoint is that I see the security mechanisms as just improvement and expansion, and also within that expansion, the ability to become more assertive, more
Pervasive?
yes, yeah, basically pervasive, and so that's why I'm being this style, not simply because it has happened, but rather as technology that people expand and such.
No, I agree.
Shall we take one last one?
So I do have a question. It's not quite a question, but maybe a comment. I was struck by the way in which these home invasions are also processes of emasculation, right? And there's a way in which pulling the man out of his bed, often either in his pajamas or sometimes naked or his underwear, and showing them off, is a kind of purposefully emasculating. And so then that we think there's a kind of reinscription of the home as the site of the feminine here, right? I think that might be interesting. I mean, so it's not really a question from where I wanted to hear you think about that. The kind of symbolic reproduction of home or private home, and this is my question, obviously, but private public, but home, home outside, right? And I don't want to. I guess I'm asking this question partly because I don't want to fall into the kind of reinscription of home as a side of feminine, right? But there seems to be within the securitarian logic, at least, a way in which there is a reinscription of the home as a side of feminine, precisely because it's through the home that emasculates the terrorists by right? And so there's a kind of reinscription of I don't know what to call it, but like a modernist politics of gender politics, right? I mean, a kind of symbolic order here that seems to be reproduced through these securitarian practices.
But in order to emasculate within the home, wouldn't that require a prior recognition of the home as, the man of the castle, the king of the castle kind of version of the home? Because, I mean, and I agree, there is an emasculation. And one of the things that strikes me is in the American context, right after September 11, there was a number of different home raids, and a number of Muslim women complained that one of the major things that they did was the security police refused to allow women to cover themselves once they were inside. So obviously they're covered inside there, and then they're in there, and that actually became part of the interrogation. Was to keep them off their toes in many ways, but keeping them off their toes is often in very gendered and sexualized ways. I don't think that addressed your question, but I think we just add to it. I think we need to think through that a bit more. But it seems to me that there is both the recognition and then the attempt to sort of deny that space as a masculine space, and that the security part of the reason why they're directing it at the men is because in many ways, as men, they often don't deal with women in the interaction at all. So there's a strange kind of masculine logic in the fact that I'm dealing with you as a man. And sometimes they talk about the fact that, well, of course I'm not just going to go harass the women. And so they see that as part of their, well, I'm such a good man because I'm not harassing the women, I'm just harassing the man in front of the women.
Yeah. Which I think speaks to also this question of women as extremists and this kind of debate about what to do with the female suicide bomber, female shooter. Okay, I think we can come back to some of these questions in the context of the roundtable because I'm mindful of time. So I'd like to thank Gilbert very much. It was very thoughtful. And ask Yassir to sit in this seat so that you can see my computer's run out of battery. You want to be right next to the screen, just slightly off to the side. Okay, so I'll just sit here for a second for the purpose of the live stream and just to introduce Yassir. You don't get the
no.
I'll turn it off in a second. So Yassir is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Muslim and Non-Muslim Understanding, University of South Australia. To my mind, is one of the most brilliant up-and-coming critical race theorists in Australia. And I'm very pleased that he's going to be publishing the first book in the new book series that I'm co-editing with Gavin Titley, called Challenging Migration Studies. That's just a bit of a plug for Yassir's book, but also for the book series, if anybody's looking to publish something. It's going to be extremely fascinating analysis of what we could call the Islamophobia industry. So yes, I don't have the title of your paper right in front of me, but you can introduce that yourself.
Thank you, Alana. I wasn't intimidated going after Mayanthi, but I am now after being called. But thank you for the compliment. I'm notoriously soft-spoken, so if anyone can hear me, please give me that evil eye or a hand gesture, and I'll do my best. As Alana hinted, my talk is really is located within an overall project about examining what I call the discourse of Islamophobia, and by that I do not just mean a discussion of what Islamophobia means. I mean also the way we have come to discuss and talk Islamophobia. I was fascinated by Mayanthi's point because a big part of the way I've interpreted it is in that similar Foucauldian sense of a coercion to confess a supposed secret that is inscribed into the discourse about how we speak about Muslims. There's always this inner subject hidden beyond the external, visible Muslim. And that's done both by Islamophobia and anti-Islamophobia. To give you an example of this, I remember I was doing, in 2007 when I was doing my honours, I was participant in a Muslim leadership program, which was code for de-radicalization, prior to de-radicalization, and we get introduced as these young Muslims are also architects and they're studying politics, you know? So look beyond the experience, they've also got a skill set which can naturalize and normalize it. Yeah? And we met various religious leaders, and one was a fairly senior member of the Catholic Church in Australia, and he was adamant and really wanted to prove there was a sense of necessity to tell us that he was our friend on the right side of that Islamophobia divide. And he said, I don't hate any of you, I love you all. And the reason he loved us all was fascinating. It's because inside of you all is Jesus. Yeah? And so, I know, as a good Muslim, I said, peace be upon you. So there's this, going back to the idea of a secret, of something concealed within me that needs to come out, be it Jesus, be it that I'm a citizen, be it that I'm an architect student, be it that I'm normal, be it, and forgive me for the gender, I don't know how to say this, but be it that beneath my veil or beneath my hijab is just hair. So, bad joke. Sorry, Gilbert. So, as a broader discussion, I go back to Brian Clark, who speaks about the coming of age of the term Islamophobia. There's now discourse about it, what it means, the politicization of the term, the necessity to speak about it in ways, and then almost in all instances and definitions of Islamophobia, there's an interpolating of that Muslim that is ideal for the person doing an anti-Islamophobia. So for the liberal, the Muslim is a citizen that is misrecognized by the Islamophobia. Maybe for the nationalist, Muslim is French is misrecognized by Islamophobia. So in almost sense, there's a Jesus sort, form residing within the misrecognized Muslim. And this is inscribed into the debate about Islamophobia. And therefore, for me, both Islamophobes and anti-Islamophobes at least have a tendency to first articulate the very thing that they're attempting to rescue or bring it out or elicit that secret and that confession. And so for many of us as Muslims, we have to, I guess, as members of this discourse, and almost interpolate from this discourse, produce a subject within this discourse, often take the tract of responding like this. Very early on I would hear things like, I'm Australian because I love food. Yeah? Or, let's have a barbecue. And all that's been said about the Grand Mufti, one of his most famous but less reported statements when he first came out, was that Australia is not just about koalas. Yeah. And it's hooking into that national imaginary. That, I'm intimate with the idea that Australians love football and eat sausages. It's such an un-Australian thing not to do, right? So that's the overall context. However, within that, I've also recognized that so much, and as a Muslim myself, I participate in the community, so much of our debate and discussion and response is done through the negation. So we've always had to try and understand ourselves from the position of what we're not. And that has multiple ripple effects within the community debates and discussion. I listened with interest to the question about homelessness that was brought up. One of Salman Said's points about homelessness, Muslim as a homelessness, is that, in a way, it's a subject beyond its own discursive horizons. We don't know, we find it more and more difficult to speak of a Muslim that belongs to a traditional set of axioms born from the Quran and Sunnah, for example. And as somebody who's trying to get into academia, I've come to recognize that I've continually had to censor the overtly religious discussions about where I come from, how I speak, So in that conversation, what I want to do in this talk is kind of tease out the caricature positions within the community that are attempting to challenge this negation of what I'm not by looking at a positive confirmation of what it means to be Muslim and how that works, whether it is working. So my talk is really about everyday Islamophobia, but its relationship with Islamism. And for really obvious reasons, we've all heard it, I don't need to repeat it. There's this common line that Islamophobia somehow leads to radicalization of sorts, alienation. And again, this is a very kind of liberal-dominated imaginary that if you're outside of the center, the solution to that is to bring you within the center, and you'll receive the benefits of it. And the double bind of that is already been discussed in the previous two speakers. So I want to kind of reconstruct, as a form of caricature, an internal conversation that I once belonged to between four voices within the Muslim community, debating Islamophobia, but with the intention of a positive response, one that isn't about simply negating, because we have come to recognize that all we ever do is explain ourselves. And that becomes incredibly self-defeating, because inevitably we begin to racialize our own insecurities. Because we have to continually speak of ourselves as from a distance from a constructed ideal center. So in that sense, my question that animates this short talk is, does Islamophobia create a certain form of Islamism? And as a form of definition, I'm just going to, being Egyptian, being that my surname is Morsi, I'm going to use the Brotherhood definition, the slogan of the Brotherhood, where Islamicism is often said is Islam. Islam is the solution. Islam is the solution. That's as an anchor point into an entry about Islam being a fundamental response to the ails of Muslim conditions in modernity, but also to the kind of lag behind where we are. Now, in this short discussion of where we're at, I won't mention names, and in a sense, it's somewhat sloppy scholarship because it's caricatures more than actual ethnography. So the first voice was a young sister who wears her hijab in a way that is, when I read fascination, it's kind of Muslim French, and in itself, using Mayanthi's word, in itself here, it's stuck together in almost unfriendly terms. Its contradictions are precisely its meaning. And there's many of us who have interpreted Muslim Australia, it's stuck together through its kind of contradictions. And it creates these tensions, right? And this young sister, you can tell, I know, any Muslim who's participating in community debates, she's wearing a hijab in a kind of modern fashion sense, right? It's not covering, let's say, the top part of her body. It's not a medal. It's kind of like a hybrid form of European fashion marked with Islam. It's a new identification, which begins to talk about trying to gender Islamophobia naturally through her own internal external experiences, by being overly visible, charges the other three brothers who are there with their kind of overly masculine politics of fighting back as neglecting that when they fight back, she suffers. Because she's the overly visible Muslim. Begins then to debate and incredibly, almost accidentally, mentions the word feminism. Yes, you all know where this is going. Okay. And in her discussion of details about her life, what inevitably happens, it gets abrupted by the word feminism, because another brother who imagines himself as part of an Islamist movement bringing back of Islam instantly sees this term as both foreign and threatening and ultimately Western. The debate no longer becomes about her life, but it becomes about an identitarian between who and where we're at. And the solution here becomes Islam is our solution. We don't need feminism because everything is already inscribed into Islam. She becomes a doubly misrecognized subject, misrecognized by the West, but also misrecognized herself as a Muslim, according to this point. You don't realize you don't need feminism. And here feminism isn't. I can assure you that this brother isn't well read in feminism, right? It just becomes that which is signified for the West. In fact, the West expands more and more because almost everything about our struggles either gets defined between or Islam against the Body of Islam. On that binary, I apologize for my sentence name. It's terrible. So a third person intervenes, and this Muslim has a particular position in respect to the social as opposed to the religious. And he confronts let's say the Islamist brother and says, but that neglects the conditions, the material conditions that we enjoy. You're a member of the West. You live here. You enjoy its material benefits. And you are speaking about Islam as if it's disassociated, divorced from the realities of our bodies, effectively. Yeah? Now this person gets called postmodernist. Okay? And now the entire debate, rather than be about the conditions upon which we are enduring, becomes about how to identify our Islam. A fourth voice enters the debate, and it's a purely ethical position, where one needs to recognize that Islam fundamentally about promoting good. And there is a certain criticism here that this going down the path of our political condition has the potential to seduce us and move us away from our Islam. Echoing certain sentiments that have been said recently, it's wrong to be angry. It will take you away. You join Jedi, one day you'll join the dark side, right? If you become angry. So in these conversations, what I found fascinating and interesting, at least as a participant as well, is that almost all of these engagements with Islamophobia, about the responsibilities of enduring the idea that you're an other or alien, becomes constituted in the debate how to exit through a kind of an aspect of Islam. I want to pause here for a second, because what's interesting for me is that these conditions, the ethical, the legal say, the reading the social context, the gender aspect of it, all get separated and become in context, which is really interesting because now you are either talking about the colonial conditions or the ethical values or the legal aspect of Islam as if they are a competition for Islam being the solution. There's a famous central hadith in our tradition, the hadith of Jibreel, where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ comes and is received and asked the messages, Muslims don't judge, asked, and he reduces, angel Jibreel describes Islam broken into three dimensions. Islam and Ihsan. Islam becomes kind of, for William Chick, this expression of the three dimensions is an aspect of the multiple dimensions of our lives. So there, one aspect, there is the intellectual understanding of faith. And then there's the Sharia or the legal aspect which controls our bodies, regulates our everyday practice. And then there's the Ihsan, the spiritual aspect of imagining good, the ethical dimensions. In the literature of Islamophobia, what's fascinating about it, it almost always overly focuses on an aspect of Islam that is about either the body or and I've tried to come up with this kind of awkward term called Islamophobia, which is the kind of phobia of an Islamic spirituality to be a guiding principle for Muslims to recognize them as a solution. That aspect is kind of left aside where we can no longer imagine our political potential or our future outside of set forms of subjects, as citizens, as liberals, as Democrats, as Australians. Because what happens, as a Muslim, you have to inevitably conceal another primary European Enlightenment subject that exists with us. To give an example of this without getting too philosophically into it, because I often butcher it, there's a distinction between the Heideggerian distinction between ontological and ontic, which can be translated between the capital I Islam and the small I Islam. A capital I Islam is one that is it's a political imagination, a discursive horizon in its own tradition. The small I Islams are multiple articulations of it. And what's interesting about the discourse of Islamophobia is that it almost intuitively, in this kind of post-racial sense, it wants to break down essentialisms. It wants to break down the idea of a generalized singular Muslim, because it sees that as Islamophobia. And in that kind of Foucauldian sense where it draws the analogy of man being drawn at the side of the sea. The water comes and washes away man as a historical moment. I want to use that analogy visually because anti-Islamophobic discourses often come and wash away the generalized, essentialized category of Muslim. But the question I want to ask is what remains after that anti-Islamophobic deceit? So often what remains is already set categories, citizen, democrat, so on. And what we can do here, and I read with interest in Mayanthi's chapter, is that what remains is almost an appeal to the individualized kind of neoliberal tradition of I. And here you have a capital I and a small I in a different sense. I, first and foremost, of what we all share is a base humanism or an I exists. And the secondary category comes my particular Muslims, a particular gender, my particular. So in a sense, as a Muslim, I can only ever speak after the fact I have reconstituted myself as a safe European philosophical political category. Which begs all the questions back to this debate that I went with the young Muslims. How can Islam be a solution if it itself can no longer constitute a political category? Especially when its multiple dimensions are separated, where the ethical and the legal are always in contest. In a sense, what Islamophobia does quite well is draw quarters where almost every aspect of my life becomes divorced from it, from any form of continuity, and I have to be in contest. So a person such as myself, and I'm not saying this as any regret or celebration, I'm not religious by form of praxis. I'm trying to be, but I'm not. At the moment I oppose Islamophobia, I in my own community will be sometimes declared as overly Western and secular, because I'm not echoing any sense of a solid Islamic subject. But part of the reality is, of this, especially in this kind of post-colonial condition where so many of us are orphans of modernity, is that we don't know how to constitute that solid category. And it elicits threat after threat after threat. So, how much time do I have?
5? Okay.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if we go a bit over, right? Everybody's okay with it.
I'm just figuring out what else to say.
You can wrap it up.
So, as a concluding point, I'll go back to this debate between the 4 young Muslims. And one voice brought the solution, or Islamism, as the Islamic solution, down to the fact that we had to build stronger communities. In a sense, we had to participate in public duty as civil servants, create avenues in society for the homeless, tackle drug issues, combat domestic violence, and all of this became politicized so we could prove that we were citizens as well as doing our jobs. Yeah? And then, just like the sister had unfortunately said the word feminism, he said democracy. Another brother came in and said, no, democracy is, like we have to vote, we have to participate in the political system. Another brother came and said, no, democracy is hard. Participating in voting is not of our tradition. The third person came in and said that we participate through paying taxes, we still were part of the system anyway. It would make no sense not to participate politically. And again, this debate was no longer about the interpretation of the political environment we inherited. It was about trying to reconstitute what an ideal Muslim is in response to all this. So in many ways, Islamophobia, on its multiple levels, interpolates the need and necessity for a solid Islamic subject without, in that sense of homelessness, without any reliance on Islamic discourse that can perhaps articulate it, even if it's in context with itself. So really what we become is various different degrees of not jihadist, terrorist, not unstable, not unintegrated, and so forth. That's what it becomes. Then, as a final point, the debate about haram came back to an internal conflict within the religious discourse, especially within Ahl Sunnah Jama'ah, about that's so typically Salafi. I'm not sure if all of you know. And we reduced the religion entirely just to the one dimension and ignored the ethical and quality of pursuing a response. Everything was reduced to haram and halal. And the response was, yes, that's the guide for our religion. And I want to take as a final point here the term halal, which is often what my talk is about. Because I want to move beyond kind of the jurisprudence definition of what constitutes halal. Almost like a discursive definition of the way it's being played out in current debates in Australia, where I've joked with Alana before, where an Anzac biscuit that becomes halal becomes a symptom and sign of Australia's decline and pending Islamicization, right? So here the word halal not only belongs to the Islamic tradition, which has jurisprudence and set up kind of processes to determine what is halal and haram. Now it's become a politicized category where it identifies your everyday participation in Australian society as a politicized participation. That I'm eating halal because I'm a Muslim, or they're eating halal because they're un-Australian. And this concept here kind of brings me to the sense, well, what occurs, what happens when almost every aspect of what we do on a mundane, everyday level becomes a political act. In the sense it's overly politicized. Yeah? Where debates about they're wearing a hijab because they're trying to be defiant. Yeah? Or to the fact that sometimes I'm accused of over-determining my Muslimness. Yeah? To debates about, well, I'm going to resist the democracy. I'm going to resist the West by not voting. Almost all in our thoughts become, in the sense of the Muslim community, becomes negotiated between what is haram and what is halal. In a sense, what is Islam and what is not. And so as a concluding point, this is me thinking out loud about how much of our everyday acts become both racialized, politicized, negotiated in a set of discourse about problem and solution. Whether or not this elicit and interprets and bring forwards, and Islamophobia that brings forwards the necessity of Islamism, which if unarticulated properly, turns into a kind of shallow anti-Westernism, which is almost, this is not me, but I will say it, almost becomes fertile ground for radicalization, whatever that means. That's the argument, we have this sense of alienation, therefore we need Islam to be the solution. But an Islam that is ultimately, as a concluding point, divorced homelands from any of its discursive lineage, which comes out from the 1400 years plus and into multiple descriptions of what it may mean to be Muslim. Okay, thank you very much for that.
Okay, should we take a few questions to Yassir before we invite the other two up as well?
That was fascinating, and I think I understood the argument. So if the question doesn't make sense, then probably it didn't. But it sounds like you're making both the critical and ostensibly a normative argument. And the critical art part, I think is really, I absolutely agree with. I'm curious, because it sounds like what you're saying is that there's that the terms of interpolation in the wake of colonial modernist transformation, right,
make it impossible for Muslims to constitute themselves in any way. Always make it necessary that Muslims constitute themselves in relation to the categories of kind of colonial and post-colonial modernity. Do you think that there is? Then it sounds as if you seem to be making the argument that it could be otherwise.
It's, I think I know where you're going, but I could be wrong, so I'll let you finish. But I want to add, perhaps you can come back. I'm trying to do two things. I am questioning the kind of essentialism of the Muslim that is created for ideal purposes, be it from racist or anti-racist. But I'm also cautious of the kind of anti-essentialism that empties out the Muslim of any capacity to interpret itself beyond that modernity. Now, the question is, do I believe in the possibility outside of this?
Yes.
And here is it's interesting. I'm going to try and take a step out of this. My community and the discussions I belong to believe in the possibility that's out of this. And they're trying to pursue, at least in the conversations I belong to, pursue a Muslim, dare I say it, that's more authentic beyond this violence. And that authenticity often ties itself to, we have to return, Islam is the solution. We have to return to some discourse that is authentically about our own coordinates. If you ask me whether that's possible or impossible, I'm skeptical about how much of modernity we can believe in that process. But it's interesting to know that that's the debate. And what inevitably happens is there is a level of an impasse here. That the desire is actually, the discourse creates the desire for it. It doesn't create the capacity.
George?
I mean, it seems to me that what you're talking about is an inability to articulate nuance in a nuanced sense of the collective identity. And is that, I mean, I'm just wondering, is that just and it's probably a follow-up to this question, is that just an inability sort of contemporary nation state? Is the kind of the firmer ground you're seeking something that has to be transnational?
Yes and no. Again, see, I'm as a scholar, there's a deep contradiction. I recognize this, and I'm not sure if this is what you're asking, but I'll go down that path and tease it out. So much of my critical work is an attempt to recognize kind of discursive construction. I mean, I'll start again. Technical science work orientalism. A major point in science work is that the very idea of an authentic Muslim is orientalism. The very constitution of a notion of a starting point of a Muslim that is beyond the various worldviews that they are. Yeah? So there's only really small I Islam's or small M Muslims. Yeah? And it's the actual Orientalism that created the idea of a singular, daunting, capital M Muslim. Now, I recognize that. But then I'm caught in the Islamism narrative as I mean by as a study of it, because for so many people that I've participated in dialogues with and discussions with, their response to this is, the response as I'm further at is Orientalism, is to seek and search for capital and Muslim. As a collective that kind of, for me as a political project, sometimes making strategic essentialism, yeah, to be able to cut across various different classes and genders and talk about shares and form. Now, on a theoretical level, I'm like, well, where and how, and what is the ground on which that can happen? But from a religious level, it almost, at least from the interpretation of religion that I have, it's almost part and parcel to recognize the ontological Islam, I mean that the transcendent Islam that comes from the Quran, not just from the day-to-day. Now that's interesting for me. Have I resolved it? Maybe that'll be my 10th book if I ever get that far. Yeah, I haven't. But what I will say, this is as a concluding comment to the question, forgive me if I took a different direction, is I've never quite understood why the particularities of the Muslim world cancels out the universality of the Muslim category. I've never fully understood why that occurs. What I mean by that is, even if you're an atheist, who comes from a Muslim family, your atheism is departed from, if you will, and here I borrow from Kenneth Craig's concept of the event of the Quran. The Quran is informing your departures, your familiarities, your proximity, your relationship with your families, your communities, and it's never been what an Islamic kind of environment. That for me means that Islam can create multiplicities without cancelling out the fact that it is an ongoing, ever-evolving conversation about the event of the Quran. Even if you're an atheist Muslim or an antagonist, it doesn't, for me, it's not like there's only one way to be. We're in conversation with Islam. In fact, if Islam doesn't happen through that event of the Quran, then none of us really begin to discuss what it means to be Muslim. On the final point, forgive me if I'm talking, for example, I hear all the time, in my own community, there's no such thing as one Muslim community, it's communities in plural. And often the description of communities is saying, well, Muslims are made up of Lebanese, Turkish, Egyptian, Pakistani, Bangladeshis, we're all different. So they break it down. What's fascinating for me is, well, there's no two Lebanese alike. So what happens, we have stable, more stable categories, like Lebanese, and less stable categories, like Muslims. And I'm just exploring whether that's politicized. That's all, like, whether or not it becomes easier to say, I mean, even the category human could be deconstructed to the point, well, there's no two humans alike, yeah? Especially when we bring into material conditions about the way people live in slums and the way people Beverly Hills. So, in that aspect, I mean, there's gender and race and so on. In that aspect, what we're effectively saying is that the Muslim category cannot be multicultural, cannot be plural, cannot inherit multiplicities in its articulation, which is an inverse of the Said argument, which is, I've got two choices. I'm either totalitarian, singular Muslim, or I'm nothing. I'm just a veneer for an internal liberal subject. Allahu Akbar.
I'm just wondering if we should move on, because it's 20 to 1. Is that okay? And you could answer a question in the context of the roundtable. So we probably finished here about 1:15, and then we'll have lunch and we'll move the past quarter of an hour later. So yeah, just while they're bringing the lunch in, Mayanthi and Gilbert, if you want to come here, I'll bring a couple more chairs over there. Okay, so it's really just an opportunity for you to pose questions, hopefully in a way in which anybody could take it up, and then the discussion can ensue also between the three of you. So, do you want to start, Matt? Maybe it can be a segue into the rest of the discussion.
Okay, but my question is, I guess, stuff like we were talking about. I have a question, but I'm particularly interested in that the problems we're talking about with how can you be an academic and Muslim and express the secular aspect of that in a way of thinking?
Well, I'm failing because I'm I've had 3 job interviews, and every time I get there, I have to manage my Muslimness. I really do. Not because it's so funny. It's just like I'm a researcher, but without. Maybe this is me, and I was saying this to Alana. Sometimes you racialize your own insecurities. Right? So, perhaps it's not happening on the table when I'm being interviewed or in academia or my experiences at the same time. But I can't help but think that there is this fundamental challenge for me that it is far easier for me to repeat the idea in these multiple manifestations that secularism is a solution in these multiple ways. It's a bit more difficult trying to bring back some concept of Islam because, firstly, instinctively from all my the left side, put it pretense. There is a sense that I'm kind of rehearsing a singular essentialist view. It's very hard to do that. It's not what I'm trying to do. Yeah. And from the other side, it becomes malleable to political abuse, where I go on television interview and I say something silly like Islam has a center. The next day, one of my directors is like, I didn't know Yassir was Salafi. So that challenge is difficult, but I can't answer it at the moment because I don't think I'm doing a good job. What I can say is I'm struggling.
Yeah. I think that kind of struggle is kind of interesting. And I'm going to be involved here and say, like, I'm interested in the way you're using or thinking about how to do the distinction. Because what I'm hearing is you're talking about different metaphysical views of what Islam is. Islam is something which is cast beyond what reality is.
I won't take too much time on that, but there's almost a kind of a bride in some of the anti-Islamophobia allegiances I have. Is that there's an allegiance, a solidarity at the expense of erasing Islam as a cosmology in itself. And I don't know I just recognize it at the moment. Yeah? And I know that from, and maybe this is my own circles, immediate circles in the community, I don't think that will translate into political mobility in my community. Because they're like hypersensitive to anything that I shouldn't say they, but in the debates I have, there's a hypersensitivity to what is Western and what is not.
Would that extend, sorry to jump in, but would that extend also to the debate around Islamophobia and racism? Because we had that discussion last year where you had led that very interesting masterclass on is Islamophobia racism. Randa was there, a few other people were also there.
Yeah, for me, Islamophobia is racism fundamentally. And I think what I find by the anti-racism that accompanies these debates is also similarly that, Muslims are easily ethnicized, they become an ethnicity. Yeah. And then it's easier to combat Islamophobia racism when we become ethnics. Now, of course, the history of racism is also about culture, religion, and everything. I'm going to separate these from the body. But again, I'm tracing, I'll throw it out there, there's an almost implicit kind of transaction here that in that anti-racism solidarity that you leave behind the non-ethnic capital ontological Muslim.
Right, the only solution is to become, it's kind of hyper-humanistic individual, right? So you can't, there's a way in which, I think this is maybe what you're getting at, there's a way in which one cannot claim a universality to Islam in the same way that one could claim a universality to the human. And even the way that the human might be configured in the Islamic tradition becomes impossible as well. Right? So there's a kind, I think that, which is a really interesting point.
Yeah, that's precisely what I'm saying. Thank you for doing it in 2 seconds.
That's what we invited. Anybody else like to say something? Yes, go on.
Because most of what I understand in this particular debate actually comes directly from the conversations I've had with him over the years, including some of my own embarrassingly theoretical positions around the same debates. But I do think it's really interesting because one of the things that's sort of occurring in Australia is there's a real difficulty for left in how to deal with what's right. So there's massive debates at the moment about a lot of sort of anti-fascist, anti-racist, mostly white organisers running campaigns on behalf of Muslims. And Muslims are like, what? This is not it's kind of pretty problematic. And so I went along to one of these events, yes, invited me. There was this interesting moment where they just started sort of yelling, getting each other excited about fighting racism, patting each other on the back. And Muslims were completely silent from this entire sort of interaction between white activists about how good they were against racism and the fight. So it's interesting, I think, in the ways in which it also means that without that kind of ontology, there's also no political voice. Right? There's no political voice. And the only way that white activists can deal with it is through older forms of humanitarian aid, that kind of stuff. So there's this real reliance on the particular kinds of activism.
And I think that's why I'm still not sold on the, the question that you were a year ago, is Islamophobia, is racism and Islamophobia coextensive? And I'm not convinced, partly because of this question of the universal. And there's a way, I think, in which, though certainly the way in which the kind of Anglo-American, like assume Australian world thinks about race is about the body and about a certain kind of right, and so the response in some ways is a level of transcendence that is about the human and a humanist human, whereas I do think that there's something about the specificity of the universalism that Islam claims that is neither about the kind of bodily particular nor necessarily about the human, right? And so I think that's also partly why many Muslims have a kind of difficulty even entering the conversation, because Islam, I mean, it's a different claim to make to say I'm Muslim. Right. Because it could ostensibly not be able to be captured by the terms, the kind of modernist secular terms that are available for politics.
Yes. I mean, there's a lot to be said for the argument that the term racism doesn't really encapsulate any of what we're talking about. Historically, it was defined in ways that excluded the majority of people who are traditionally thought of as being the victims of racism, because it didn't take into account colonialism at all. It was very narrowly focused on the rise of European fascism. But if your argument is that it doesn't apply to Muslims, equally it doesn't apply to Jews, who were the focus at the time.
Right.
So I find that really interesting. Without taking this over, I just want to make one point that in my work, I've tried to, and I've set myself a challenge, and I'm not sure I can do this, can I talk about race without talking about racism? Because if we understand race to be something to do with the management of humanity or management of human populations in some kind of way, control our management and domination of, we can divorce it from that kind of very circumscribed and proposed notion, historically proposed notion of what racism was set up to define. Yeah. So I think we can talk about Islamophobia in terms of race and racialization, but not necessarily in terms of Eurocentric conceptualizations of racism. That's something I'm suggesting might be more radar, but it's very, very difficult to do in an activist setting, because that isn't even understood. Because everything, especially in the European context, as you're aware, has been driving us away from talking about race, because that would be to naturalize and reify race. And what we do is to move away from that understanding that race is not just about the bodily.
So this capital M Muslim, how can we establish some sort of Muslim subjectivity without reproducing this sort of Eurocentric white male subjectivity that also claims neutrality, objectivity, universality?
Well, firstly, your question is what I'm trying to do. I'm actually trying to bring out the question. And that, for me, is an entry point to imagining how coloniality works, Islamophobia and racism works, in a sense. For example, in this kind of post-racial moment, we often say the Muslim silence. Actually, when you watch media, there's an over-visibility of Muslims on the media. Yeah. And so what you're happening is, for me, it's not a contradiction, it's kind of a paradox. Over-visibility of the Muslim. Often, almost always, as a Muslim, we get out in a moment of crisis after Paris or California shooting. What happens is, there's a script, almost always. And we saw the Grand Mufti depart from that script. with the slightest of departures. I was like, it wasn't even like, bring back the caliphate. It was like, being racism may be a cause of fact of radicalization, which almost, Anyway, so for me, let's just, as a form of a question, as opposed to that, I'll try and answer the question through a question. If we could imagine the over-visibility of the Muslim in this post-racial moment as precisely creating the less represented, under-visible Islamic discourse, in ways to shrink in form of, dare I say, engagement with their own texts and traditions. Now, does that mean that I believe in a solidified, singular, capital Muslim? That's the question. I'll go back to Mayanthi's point. There's hadiths that you all know that we're all born, all of us are born. The primary state is Muslim, which means on a cosmological level, we're in a state of submission to being. The trees are Muslim, the birds are Muslim, the universe is Muslim. But we can't speak in that cosmological position because Muslim has become an ethnicity, which is a secondary category to the capital I.
But I think you would also be considered to be like start breaking mad and you're starting to say, using the term Muslim in that sense, right? Because I was just thinking of the example of the caliphate. Any Muslim who thinks that the solution to Islamophobia is or that the solution to anything is the reestablishment of the caliphate is thought of as a complete crazy person. Mm-hmm. Because the very that's what I mean about the impossibility of certain kind of politics based precisely on an Islamic history, right? Because the very categories of political action mean that anyone, that's partly why ISIS is considered like lunatics, right? It's not just the violence, it's the very terms that they're using are considered completely insane. And so there's a way, and that's the silencing in some sense, right? Is that the very terms of doing politics, of sort of being modern in the world, preclude a certain kind of universalism that is understood by many people as deeply particular.
Exactly.
Right, and so I thought that that's probably what you were getting at.
We can never assume that position of universality in the sense of the human category. And that if we historicize the human category, we find it has particular origins, particular discourses, whereas the Muslim is assumed, it's a simple argument. The Muslim and Islam becomes an adjective in the same way, white because of visible. So it's always an additional category.
I don't know if you're right. I used to work on feminist awareness. She talks about the epistemology of the child. I just found that very much encapsulates what you're saying, basically. Because to me, it's not about exclusion anymore. Far left from the about exclusion. It is about annihilation.
There's a long body of work on this and kind of big comments. I was speaking to the man. We were joking at one point because his work would have to sell that Cartesian subject. And you're joking, I think therefore I'm white. That the very subject that grounds our ability to rationalize. So there's a big work on that.
To come back to the question you had, I'd pose another question, which would be, how is it that universal came to be white, straight, male? So often whenever any group begins to occupy universal, the accusation is always on now you're going to reproduce the same ones that you're opposed to. Actually, the question is, when there were so many different kinds of universalities at play across the world, how come one particular kind of universality became universal for everything? And so the violence attached to that then get attached to all other kinds of universalities which didn't have those violences. Actually, those universalities were the victims of that Western violence universality. So I would always flip it back. I'm really sure this discussions before, but flip it back to the heart of how does this come to be attached to certain kinds of violences which actually historically very happy.
So even that response, so what's happened, the deconstruction of a Western universalism is to say, no, it's actually particular. It's white, it's male, it's European, right? And so particularism becomes the sort of cudgel with which one deconstructs a universal. which I think is exactly what happened in Islam, which is, you think you're universal, but really, you're just particular. And there's no space to take seriously these what you're sort of getting at. Other forms of universalism that aren't of the same kind, right, as the universalism that we're used to working with, and we're used to taking apart precisely by saying, no, you're actually particular. So I think, for me, that's the struggle to think about, like, the possibilities of other universalisms, because universalism itself is understood as a deeply problematic approach to the world, right? As a good post-colonial leftist progressive feminist, right?
I think that's where I'm coming kind of around as well, because to me that the assertion of the universal has political content as well, and like just coming from a different belief system. One of my favorite theologians is a dude called Halal, and he's an American kind of radical theologian, and I kind of use him a lot to tell other Christians that they believe is actually not innocent belief, like they kind of stand back and like, this is what the Bible says, right? And I'm sure that's characteristic of a lot of belief systems. What his contribution is to point out the inherently political character of theology, and I would extend that to say cosmology as well in a similar vein. And it's not a bad thing, but I feel like it's just such a valuable political project to assert that particularity and to disavow its political content. To me, I'm not sure. I'm still kind of figuring out in my head. I just think it's a very valuable project, but yeah, where I'm coming around is the reassertion of the universal, where it just can't be anything but political.
Well, like deeper in the theory, like modernity, coloniality, the kind of way of posing the problematic is not necessarily as a contrast or a dividing between particular and universal. It's about the possibility of thinking pluriversal, like multiple universals, and even the possibility of non-universal, like cosmologies that don't have universality to it, not existing in or in relation to cosmologies that have a universal dimension to it. And this is the key question. Come over it, but that's my choice of the left. As a leftist, kind of unfortunately, is that it can't deal with spirituality. It can't deal with it because it needs to pursue its universal project, and so that's why you get then that kind of chauvinistic anti-racism that obliterates, because they want to they accept the I am Muslim, but they only want to talk to the I. They don't want to talk to Muslim, and they can't understand. And this is kind of to flip that kind of predicate relation. They don't understand that Islam has an I dimension to it. That Islam has subjectivities that emerge out of it. Because to say that would be it kind of shatters the universality of things. They can't deal with their universality, and that universality, the mind explodes.
So I want to push back a little bit, if I can. So just bear with me for a second. I would say two things. One is that I think there are certain forms of spirituality with which the secular or modern is deeply comfortable. Spiritualities that remain particular, that understand their particularity, that realize that they are in fact not applicable to the rest of the world, right? That's fine. It's precisely actually forms of cosmology, if I use that term, that also entail politics, that entail universalist politics, that are understood as missionary or conversion religions in some way, that are deeply problematic. And I think I want to be sort of, not suspicious, keep under interrogation our own comfort with pluralism and the idea that there are multiples, right? Multiple universalisms and multiple this and multiple spiritualities and multiple cosmologies, because that's very easy for us to work with. I think the difficulty actually lies in taking seriously, precisely, the idea that cosmologies also entail politics and sometimes, complex politics, and an understanding of the good as good for everyone is actually, people should want this, right? So I think, cosmologies that contain themselves to a sense that it's good for my community, but I'm not gonna, I don't necessarily think it's good for your community. We're fine with that, right? It's the sort of cosmologies or political theologies that actually have a more robust ethics and communal ethics that I think we as secular modern, whatever you want to call it, right, have a lot of trouble with. And I think that I think Islam presents that problem because for so long it's been a competing universe. So I'm hesitant about the move that somehow pluralism's radical pluralistic thinking is somehow going to get us out of.
But I make a distinction between pluralism and pluralism as a way of trying to deal with difference and pluralism.
The fact of plurality.
Because does that imply equality, and that's what you're.
It implies. Yeah, so I take your point that there's a difference between the fact of plurality and accepting the fact of pluralism. But one can accept the fact of plurality and still think that, things could be better, and the sort of plural. There are better ways of doing it, and they're more ethical. The notion of the good, right? I think it's very different. I think it's easy to kind of accept that there are multiple notions of the good, and we're going to stop there. But much less.
Yeah, and this is where I think also it's worth thinking about. I agree that what becomes kind of spectacular is the clash of universalism. But those cosmologies that don't have universalism are still they experience extreme violence, but they also have ways of thinking about relationality that has, I think, universalisms have something to learn about if they're going to live together.
And this is fascinating for me. I want to try and change a bit of the word. Firstly, kind of what I've discussed with you in the context of Analysing Islamophobia. And the debate about universalism, I'll give you exactly my conversations I have in our community. I have this double-blind contradiction. Every time a Muslim comes out and speaks in a universal way, I lose my shit. Because I know within that political moment we're excluding multiple forms of experiences. Yeah, right. But at the same time, I'm like, well, I don't want to deny the very fact that we could speak about. So universalism is really a particular failure. But can we speak about my failure of universalism is me being appropriated to your failure of universalism? Yeah, where I'm really just having a conversation about what it might mean to have a Muslim universalism. And for me, the conversation is actually the political activism more so than, say, somebody wants to assert universalism. Because the moment that assertion happens, I found my own instinct. I'm like, okay, then just resist. Right? I found because your Muslim is deeply masculinized, and so that's the point. But that broad toing and froing is precisely only the possibility of the fact that somebody has asserted a potential political possibility of a Muslim universalism. And going back to my talk, it's like in the current discussion about the discourse of Islamophobia, it really is just about most of it, just about the possibility of a Eurocentric form of universalism, where our exit Islamophobia, citizen, Australian. So I'm happy to establish my left, Only in conversation.
I have a question for Mayanthi. In one of your chapters, you talk about the act of wearing the headscarf as both the I might get the terminology wrong, but
Choice and obligation.
yeah. So negotiating the false binary that secularism sets up between that. I guess kind of in this talk about universalism and stuff. How do you see that kind of traditional authority being negotiated with reference to that concept of asserting universalism?
Right. So as during this discussion, I've been thinking actually about precisely that. And my own argument, ventriloquizing the arguments of some of my interlocutors, for those of you who haven't read, I talk about how the headscarf is both a choice and an obligation, but within the terms of kind of liberal notion of autonomy and self. An obligation is that which is incumbent, especially a religious obligation, is understood as that which is incumbent upon everyone, right? So the moment that you say, and the argument in the chapter is basically when the headscarf is configured as a choice, which it has to be in some ways to make it morally and ethically acceptable to a wider secular public, it becomes just a choice and then falls outside of the purview of many of the conventions on religious liberty. And then it's just a choice. So like, it's like wearing a sweater. So why would taking it off be that big a deal? But the moment that you then say, well, no, it's an obligation, many secular French people hear, well, then it's an obligation upon all women, and that makes you a fundamentalist. And so there's very little room to understand headscarf as both a choice and an obligation, where it's an obligation and the choice lies in whether or not to accept the obligation or not. Right? But it goes back to this, I think, the discussion we were just having, where in some ways, my own argument is palatable because I'm sort of saying, for many of these women, it's not, they don't see it as an obligation that they would then impose on other women. It's a kind of self-directed obligation, and once put on, it's understood as an obligation, right? And the same, the other example is like ethical vegetarianism, right? Where the choice lies in whether to accept the obligation or not. But it's much more difficult to defend women or men who think that the headscarf is an obligation for everyone and should be worn, whether or not, right, should be sort of imposed, so precisely so that one can then remake oneself, like in wearing it, right, one sort of comes to want to wear it. And I'm just thinking about this discussion. In some ways, a lot of my interlocutors are kind of familiar. I don't think they're necessarily liberal subjects, but they're familiar in a sense. The arguments that they make, the arguments that I make about them are palatable is not quite the right word, but understandable, right? Not necessarily unsettling in the way that, certain sort of Salafi notions of headscarf are deeply unsettling because they do require certain forms of imposition, and a very different understanding of the good and ethics and community itself, right? So I don't know if that was what you're getting at, but in some ways this conversation is actually making me take some of my own notions of what is unsettling and what is not.
The research does.
When I was reading your chapter on that obligation versus choice, I was reminded of when Gilbert Caluya and I were writing the crisis of multiculturalism, dealing very much with the way in which the hijab in France was interpolated, and thinking also about the case of the Egyptian woman who was murdered in Dresden, or taking to court a racist who had beaten her up and her son in a playground. And the argument that we were making is that she was having recourse to the very forms of the demonstration of her citizenship or her understanding of the European way of going about things, which is to take to court somebody who has violated anti-discrimination legislation then later on she was stabbed in the court. That's how she died. So the point was that she wasn't trying to act outside of the remit of the state. She wasn't, for example, getting her gang of brothers to go and kill the guy or, whatever, beat him up. And nonetheless, she was understood as somebody who was performing this unacceptable sound. And one of the books that you refer to in your chapter is the issue where they found the women when sexual veiled girls speak, which is a kind of interviews with 50 or so women and girls who were excluded from French schools, and also women who were excluded or attacked in public places and so on. And all of my feeling when I was reading this book was really heartrending stories of their experiences and horrible, horrible things that many people were familiar with. And all I was thinking was that the only language that they had recourse to was French Republican secular ideological language. And maybe there was one person in the entire book who actually actively said, "I reject that." And I thought that was kind of very clear. Not that that's what you were doing, but that's what's clear in the discourse of your respondents.
Right. Yeah, I remember going to a demonstration when the proposed law, the law had just been proposed, the law banning religious science in public schools, and the vast majority of and it's mostly women actually, the vast majority of them, held placards that said the veil is my choice, don't take away my right, don't take away my choice, and it was all this discourse about choice. Yeah. And it was completely sincere. So I'm not making an argument that this is somehow thought out, right? Totally sincere, right? It was understood as a violation of choice. And there was one woman, she was slightly older, and she had a placard of one of the verses from the Quran and something about obligation. And she was shunned. Like the women, they did not want her there. Like they did not want the media to pick up because it would completely undercut. Because then the whole march would be, classified as basically a bunch of fundamentalists, right? Who are talking about the obligation of the headscarf. Whereas like, you can't sort of use the term obligation because it just doesn't. It has this particular valence. But it's very similar to the veil of speech, where one has. It's not even one has to use the language. One thinks in that language. That is how the violation is understood. Right? It's a violation of choice or right.
It was interesting when you say that. Sometimes these conversations about choice actually hails the opposing voice, which just like, for example, I'll be on Facebook, which is dominated by this. Somebody will bring up an interview with some sister says, "Hijab is my choice," and then that will actually hold forward all these voices like this. Hijab is fucked. It's obligatory, yeah, and that voice becomes this like a corrective measure against what they see as a theft by Muslims who are now government recognized. Yeah, so it's interesting because that, when we choose our language, kind of creates a universalism in opposition. And then that whole has all sorts of complications for me because it's not even really about hijab. It's just about which of the political subject we should speak about.
And who is the side one?
Yeah.
Well, it's 20 past 1, but anything you want to say? Anything else or anybody where you like to? Okay. Well, what I hope is that the majority of you will stay this afternoon and that we can kind of continue this discussion in the context of the masterclass. I think basically this discussion that we're having, as well as talking about methodological and philosophical issues. And there is a little bit of lunch, I hope it's enough. And this is a bit of a one-woman show when it comes to the catering and the live streaming and all things, so forgive me. And there's also a cafe just here if you want better coffee. And I think we'll resume at 2:30 or 2:20. That gives everybody an hour to kind of relax. And we can use these tables. Well, some people just space that
I was going to say too, if someone wants to come to the workshop that hasn't come in, I have my book, so you can also just borrow it and like quickly the intro or one and I'm happy to do that.
I think it's more valuable if people attend. I just wanted to make sure that people, in terms of reference, that's my teacher decided.
No, but for that reason, just if you haven't read but are interested in the book.
I have a photocopy of it. Okay, so thank you very much to all three of you for wonderful papers and enjoy your break.
debate, right?
Yeah, that's,
Yes.
And we charge